Okay, well I can put a mark in the stream so this could go to YouTube at Rip Zencaster. It is busted for the week. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. What?
Before you start, how did your Civ game go last week?
Oh, dude, I got rolled by bandits because I didn't understand that the scouts are always preceding a bandit attack. And if you kill the scout before it escapes, then the attack doesn't come. So I got attacked from three sides by bandits. Granted, I did have 19 different kinds of technology, which I think I may have gone way too heavy in the technology department and not enough in the military, which is a pretty normal mistake from a macro StarCraft player to make, where you just ramp up your farms and your tech as fast as possible with no regard to your own safety.
Yeah, I saw some of that last week. I ended up going to bed before you finished, so I didn't know what happened with it. Yeah, it's pretty fun. Did you like it?
Yeah, I like Civ. It's got a much cozier vibe, and since you get to decide when the next turn is, you can double check things and think about your moves more so than StarCraft, where it's like trying to play as fast as possible. It's a lot more rushed.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I don't have great reflexes, so turn-based stuff is more my speed, definitely. Sorry, I was just curious.
No problem. Civ is a fun game. You've probably played a lot more of it than I have. I played the Endless Legend and stuff like that a good bit.
Endless Space.
Endless Space, yeah.
Together once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I watched you play Endless Legend, but I didn't play that myself.
Give that a try. That's a fun one. It's kind of doing its own thing, but it is fun.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can resume. I didn't mean to upset the pacing.
Oh, no problem. It's good when we have overlapping interests in the video games. Civ 6 is good. It was free for a period of time. That's why I got it.
Oh, you got it from the Epic Store.
Yeah, it was one of those, like, for a certain number of days, it's free kind of a thing.
Gotcha.
Keep an eye on that. They're handing out a bunch of different stuff. I also got GTA 5 that way.
Ah.
Yep, people.
Yeah, they're really going out of their way to try to build up user base, huh?
Yeah, with the different game launchers and that kind of thing, it's pretty annoying to install another entire game launcher. So they're giving people a really good reason to have the Epic Games launcher on their computer.
Yeah. Do not a lot of people use that?
If you're comparing it to the Blizzard launcher, probably, yeah, not that many people, but across all of their games, it's used a decent bit. I haven't really followed a lot of the different ones. I mainly play StarCraft 2 and Classic WoW, which both use the Blizzard one. There's also the Origin launcher. What are some of the other ones? There's a Riot Games launcher.
I think Stardock has one.
Yeah.
There's more than a few.
Steam?
I actually thought you were... Huh?
There's Steam?
Yeah, that's the one I used to message you.
Mm-hmm.
Because you didn't settle that first settler on the first turn. I was trying to message you.
Oh, yeah.
Just do it on the first turn.
Yeah, Chad told me about that by like turn 4. You know you should have expanded first, right? Oh, okay.
Well, what did you want to get on first? What caught your eye this past week?
Well, the big thing that's been affecting the livelihood of a lot of people is the riots in the U.S. So there's Mr. Floyd.
Yeah, what about that? You're up in Seattle, right? How's it been up there?
8 police vehicles were burned to a crisp yesterday.
In downtown?
Yeah. Lots of the stores are being broken into. They describe it as looting, which I'm kind of fuzzy on the definition of this term. My impression was looting is when you are breaking in and taking stuff to keep for yourself, whereas it seemed like they're just like messing up things, like throwing things on the ground and distributing chaos, basically, more so than grabbing items that you would later use, from the video footage that I was watching.
Yeah, there's been some vandalism like that, interspersed with the looting and protesting, and it's kind of a grab bag. Yeah, different places are being impacted differently. I think Minneapolis had it the worst, because obviously that was ground zero for the initial killing. I'm assuming everybody kind of knows why all of this is happening. There was for those of you who maybe haven't been, or maybe have been living under a rock for the past week or so, there was a guy who was detained by the police in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And while he was being detained on the ground, the policeman in question put his knee on his neck and kept it there until he suffocated to death, even though he was telling the policeman that he couldn't breathe and not to kill him and etc. And it was caught on camera, so the video was there for all and sundry to see. So there's not really any disputing it. So that sparked all of these protests and riots and whatnot.
Oh,
and there's a
I was going to say, for some context of people outside the U.S., the tension between people of color and police enforcement has been ongoing for as long as we can remember.
I guess I didn't even mention it. Yeah, the guy who was killed was a black man, and then the police officer was a white man. So there was an immense amount of symbolism there. And that just touched a raw nerve, politically speaking.
Yeah, we had the civil rights movement in the 60s, 70s, stuff like that. But as we've talked about in the past, once you abolish slavery, you don't eliminate racism, like in one swoop. And then in addition to that, a lot of racism, whenever you change a law or something, it recedes some. Like, you can drive it into a corner or make it less prominent, but you can't remove it entirely just by a simple step. It's based on the norms changing over time, which, as we've discussed, is an extremely slow and glacial process. It's not something that you can just be like, you guys should have democracy, and then you just give them a constitution and you're like, they're going to be fine now.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not as simple as that, and that's a really good summary just right there. I mean, up until the 1960s, efforts to fight racism were largely institutional. How can we remove institutional blocks to the African American community in the United States? And that kind of culminated in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And there are still legal inequalities, here and there, but the big one, segregation, and manifestations thereof, that was dealt a death blow in 1965. So institutionalized racism of that sort was removed in 1965, but systematic racism, such as it is, and cultural norms that undergird racism, those things are much more difficult to change because they are sort of, they're not concrete. They can't really grasp them or see them. These are ambiguous concepts, and it's difficult then to legislate them away. The old saying is that you can't legislate morality, and in effect, that's kind of where we are. This is a disease of the spirit, so to speak. Prejudice and intolerance and things of that nature, they're just devilishly difficult to deal with through political institutions.
Well, one of the main reasons for that is because it's propagated through families and across generations. It's not like people are as much learning racist tendencies from their teachers and stuff. Oftentimes it's family members, like the people who are closest to you, who you oftentimes trust more than the people you would like get your education from. So it's passed down generation to generation. Each generation ideally will pick up a few things from what their parents and grandparents say and then say, you know what, that's kind of fucked up, Grandma. You shouldn't say that. And if you do that over the course of centuries and millennia, you can make some pretty substantial progress. But over the course of a single decade, there's still a lot of work to be done in any given snapshot of that.
Yeah, it's something ingrained in American cultures, especially certain regions. You know, the southeastern United States was a part of a kind of greater Caribbean political economy that was based off of plantation slavery. And that sort of formed the cornerstone of the society there. I mean, slavery was also present in the rest of the United States. It was an important tool by which the early colonies were built, since it was very difficult to get skilled labor in the Americas in the 1600s, because those colonies were pretty barren, isolated. They were very far away, undersupplied, and it was just tough living there, to the point that it was really hard to get anybody to go there who actually had things like carpentry skills, advanced farming skills, things like that. And so that gap was filled with African slaves who were brought over. So, even in places like Boston or New York City, in their earliest history, they actually had a relatively large population of slaves. Well, maybe I should say relatively large proportion of their population that was actually African slaves. It kind of fell over time in the North, that proportion, that is to say, because, in the early days, they didn't have enough labor, but obviously as Boston and New York and other places grew in population, they started to develop a larger pool of European labor, and that ended up kind of supplanting a lot of the African labor by the 1700s or so. I'm just going to say this early this time because it's a sensitive subject. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I say anything that's stupid, biased, or wrong, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I will see your feedback. And I do learn a lot from chat when we do this. It is much appreciated to get feedback like that. So that said, slavery was important in the early 1600s and then kind of faded in the North, but in the South it was just always important. It was just the bedrock of the economy. And in turn, because that was the case, the political system was built around owners of slaves and the plantation economy, to the point where there was a lot of people who did not own slaves in the South who really hated the plantations and the slaves. Because what plantation owners would do, I was reading about this in the book on Reconstruction I was reading last year. What slave owners would do is that they would not give the slaves themselves the right to vote, but they would demand to have extra voting power based on how many slaves they owned, because they were sort of the steward of the slaves. They were the nominal justification for slavery was always that they were civilizing them. They're better off here than they were in Africa. That was a common refrain back then. And what they would say is that, I represent these people because I am their owner and steward, and that I'm trying to help them better themselves. So I should have the right to vote on their behalf. And because they had so much political power in the South, that actually happened. I don't think it was like one vote per slave. I think it was some weird fraction, kind of like the 3/5 clause in the U.S. Constitution back in the day. There was something similar in a lot of southern states' constitutions in that vein. And there was a lot of enmity on the part of the poor whites who lived in the mountains in the Appalachian region, because they saw that as obviously unfair. Obviously, the slaves are probably not being represented accurately by the slave owner. And so in that sense, the slave owners had disproportionate political power. And that's to say nothing of just the general disenfranchisement of poor people in the South at the time, to the point where they were at the pinnacle. That is to say, the slave owners were just at the pinnacle of political power. So that whole system just defined the political culture, the economy, and then in general, the culture. And that's not something that's going to go away very quickly, because it was there for hundreds of years, and it was just enforced very brutally for a long. I was kind of Googling while Nero was talking, because I think Thomas Jefferson had a really cool quote. Well, maybe not cool quote, but a really relevant quote in which he was talking about how democracy is kind of antithetical with the institution of slavery, or maybe more generally, the propagation of democracy is antithetical to the propagation of slavery. I don't think I can find it just here off the top. I would love to find it because I want to read it just verbatim, but the gist of it was that generation after generation, children of slave owners and also non-slave owners, just white children in general in the South, would see their fathers beating other people, black people, their slaves, whipping them mercilessly, violently. And they would grow up with that, and it was normalized violence to them. And this was done for generations. And his point, and I hope I'm remembering this correctly, but his point was that that kind of culture cannot really cultivate a spirit of democracy in a political culture, and that it's very difficult to reconcile the cultures that do emerge on account of it. So that's what we're dealing with. That's the legacy. The legacy of that culture is what we're kind of trying to manage here in the United States and in U.S. culture. And as we've seen over the past half century, it's not something you can legislate away. You can legislate such that you mitigate the amount of damage that prejudiced people can do, that the state can do. But there are going to be choke points in the society, especially in an open society like the US, where the government has a relatively small role, where prejudiced people can exercise economic power and communal power over black people specifically, if not people of color in generally. And that being the case, then it just makes it very difficult for people to just believe in the state, to have faith in the system when they are systematically oppressed in that way, if not in other ways as well. And that's just something we've been struggling with ever since '65. It was actually easier, I think, before the Civil Rights Act, because there was something to look forward to. Legal equality was something tangible that you could focus on and advocate, and you could argue that if we get that, then everything else will just kind of fall into place later. We just need to get legal equality now and be equal with our other Americans. And as we've seen, since '65, and as I've just kind of elaborated, as Neuro and I have elaborated, it's not that simple. It was definitely a step forward, but it's going to be a long, slow process by which the African American community kind of rises up against these barriers. I don't know what the long-term equilibrium is. That's a whole other debate. Are we going to eliminate racism such that everybody is equal? Or are they going to just develop economically to the point where it's just not efficacious or meaningful to be prejudiced against them? Or are they just going to integrate completely, and is everybody just going to be a single race? There's a lot of different ways that could pan out over the long term, 30, 40, 50 years, etc. But in the short to medium term, there's probably not going to be a lot of change, unfortunately. Change in that vein is sticky, so to speak, to use an economist's term. Things do not change easily in that sense. So the most you can do is just to try to advocate as much as possible for social equality, and to try to fight prejudice where it emerges, and to try to make the case for communities like that was about to say have the boot on their neck, but that's probably not the best analogy at this moment. But you get the idea, And it's because of that problem that is ongoing in the United States that this moment is just so volatile. And I'll add here that this is not even the first incident this year. Just a couple weeks ago or a month or so ago, there was a guy in, I think, Georgia, another black man in Georgia who was killed by, I think, ex-cops. I think it was supposed to be some kind of self-described vigilantes. They tried to justify it after the fact by saying that there had been robberies in the area and that they wanted to stop this guy and talk with him, but they ended up shooting him, which was also caught on video. So, that style of murder, that sort of implicit prejudice against black people held by certain Americans, if not many, if not most Americans, that does have severe consequences in circumstances like that, or at least that's the accusation. It's a whole debate, and I'm not gonna get super into it, because I'm not really well versed enough in the history of the civil rights movement and the African American community to really fully do them justice on the issue. Yeah, it's a long history, and it's complicated, and it's sensitive. Like I said, I think my Facebook feed, like everybody else's in the US, has been lighting up, and there's just a lot of angst and acrimony. So without doing more research, I wouldn't really want to delve too much into the specifics of the politics involved. But in general, I do want to at least try to describe the background, because that I think is what we can do, at least what we can contribute here in this particular format that we have here. So yeah, that's roughly how we got here, and that's why, again, the previous killing kind of set the ground and set the kindling, as it were, and this latest killing was just the straw that kind of broke the camel's back. I don't know if you've seen the video or not, Neuro, have you?
I have not.
You have not. You know, there's been a lot of videos. I mean, for those interested, I don't necessarily recommend it, but there are a lot of videos that you can watch of police killing people, you know, both in the US and outside the US. And, you know, of all the videos like that I've seen, this is not the one that I would have expected to spark national protests. I mean, it's relatively tame compared to, say, the Rodney King beating or, you know, some of the other stuff that you can see. But again, I think the reason that this particular incident, this particular video was just so, so instigating, was two things. One, the previous murder that had happened before already had a lot of people on edge. And then also the fact that this particular incident happened just in broad daylight and happened so casually. You know, just the fact that it was recorded and that there were people telling the officer that he was choking, and the guy himself was telling the officer that he was choking, and nothing happened. And also other officers were there and were not doing anything. And it just seemed to really encapsulate the feeling, you know, the sentiment that the police are just apathetic and don't care about murdering black people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I say it's the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, you can find more violent videos than that, but just the symbolism, the raw symbolism at this particular point in time, I think is really what set things off this time.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the fact that we've got COVID-19. You know, there's a lot of people who are unemployed and have spare time. So lots of people can engage in political activism. You know, they have more time to get involved, to kind of see the information out there, and to engage in protests and whatnot. So there's a public that is more ready and willing to respond than there would be under perhaps normal circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's pretty messed up stuff. People are very tense right now in general, so I would say the racial tension in the US is always there. And since, like you said, people are out of work and already grumpy and stuff, and this case was a very blatant mistake. Like, I think sometimes it'll look like kind of a close call where the police officer is really having trouble interpreting the situation. Mm-hmm. Like, maybe there was a sudden movement and it spooked him or something. And for situations like that, you are a combat officer where if there's violence, you are the person who is being paid to address it first, which is a pretty scary job. But yeah, in this case where someone is already pinned to the ground and stuff, there's not really that, I guess, doubt that you could fall back on.
Yeah, I mean, even if it hadn't been recorded, it probably would have been negligent homicide, because the technique that he was using to pin him on the ground was actually illegal. Well, maybe illegal is not the word I want, but the police department had explicitly stated that it was not to be used, specifically because it was so dangerous, you know, because that could happen. And, you know, I've seen more than a few cops on social media saying that that was just totally wrong. It's just totally antithetical to what police are supposed to do and how they're supposed to exercise discretionary power, of which they have an immense amount of. So that technique that he used was against regulations. You know, I'm not sure what the proper terminology would be, but it doesn't really surprise me, though, which is another kind of thing that kind of caught me off guard about the video. You know, because cops have to detain people like that all the time. You know, I mean, if you want to marathon your way through several episodes of Cops and Live PD, like I did last year during a spell, you'll see lots of cops having to do that, because what'll happen is they'll have some guy who loses his shit, and then they just have to hold him until backup can arrive, which is what was happening in that video pretty much. You know, they were waiting for paramedics and backup to come in so that they could move him. And so it wasn't unusual that they were holding him on the ground like that. but it was just the way that he was holding him on the ground that ended up killing him, and just the fact that he wasn't willing to respond to the fact that one, the suspect was saying that he couldn't breathe, which, to be fair, isn't unusual. I mean, lots of people will tell you they can't breathe if you're holding them on the ground, whether they can or not. That's something else that police have to deal with. People lie all the time, but especially after he stopped responding, that really should have been a red flag for the officer. He shouldn't have had his knee in the first place. And after he did have it in place, he should have listened to him when he said he couldn't breathe. And after he stopped breathing, he should have done something. There was time after he stopped breathing to maybe resuscitate him, but that didn't happen.
Well, the chat is saying that he was also handcuffed already.
Yeah, they handcuffed him.
Yeah, so that seems very redundant to also be doing that.
People can do damage when they're handcuffed. Just because they're handcuffed doesn't mean they can't start shit. The handcuffing and keeping them on the ground, that's all pretty standard procedure. None of that was really all that unusual. Again, the unusual thing is that he exercised his discretionary power wrong. That was just needless violence, and it resulted in the death of a citizen who probably would not have gone to jail. I think, the original call was that he was using, counterfeit money. Like the store that he had been at, that he was outside of, accused him of using counterfeit money, and that was what the original call was for. And I don't know how much we can trust the details of what happened between the call and the incident, because that's obviously different actors are going to have different stories. I think I did read somewhere that there was some kind of scuffle, that they tried to detain him and that he resisted, and then there was a scuffle in which he was detained, and that was how he ended up on the ground. But again, I don't know the facts, so I can't say that with complete certainty.
We did talk too about how violence has happened in the past and happens in present day, and how per capita violence is down, but for how visceral the evidence is, it looks more violent than ever, because you have stuff like video evidence where it's just the exact picture of what happened. And before, it used to be more word of mouth of someone tells the story of what happened, and that's going to have some level of accuracy and less of a complete picture than a full video and stuff. So I think that it holds officers of the law accountable in a new way, which is important.
Yeah, that's an important innovation. The fact that we have so many more cameras just around everywhere with everybody in their phone, and then the police officers themselves generally have what do you call them, those cams now that they wear on their chest. So all of that is important for accountability, but like you say, it's also going to reveal a lot of the issues. I mean, no matter what you do, no matter how much reform you have, there's always going to be incidents. Even if you have a really good police force, there's always going to be something that happens that either is a terrible incident or looks like a terrible incident. And that's always going to set people off. And in that sense, having more video footage is going to cause a lot more attention, And that just ties into stuff we've talked about before about structural economic change, and the general the general tumultuous nature of the era that we live in society and whatnot. We have so many new technologies changing so many established norms that we don't really have new norms to replace them yet. We haven't adjusted yet. And I suspect one of the things we're going to adjust to is the greater access we have to video evidence. We see a lot more of the world now than we ever could before. Like, I could get online and see video of some of the most remote places on the planet that I never would have seen, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago. And that's extrapolated also just at the local political level. You can see a lot more of what your local police are doing now than you ever could before. And probably most of it is going to be totally boring, since that's what most jobs are like, even the ones that are dangerous. It's, what is it they say in the military? It's mostly boredom and then brief periods of terror, something like that. So there's going to be mostly boring stuff, and then there's going to be exciting stuff, and then some of the exciting stuff is going to be abuses of power, violence, murder, etc. That's going to happen, and you're going to see a lot more of it going forward just by dint of having greater access in that vein. And so we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. Because some of it is going to be institutional problems that need to be addressed by the public, that there needs to be reforms for. But then some of it is just going to be inevitable. Sometimes the wrong person is going to end up in uniform and you're going to have violence like that. Or sometimes incidents are going to be misinterpreted and blown out of proportion. There's just going to be a lot of churn until we can figure out the proper social norms and expectations that we should set in response to these kinds of social changes. So we're in for a wild ride for the next probably 10, 20 years while we hash all that out.
Mm-hmm. Hold fast, people. My stream slogan used to be keep fighting, but in 2020 I've started saying hold fast instead because people are already fighting too much. I meant it as keep fighting as in persevere, like when you're feeling like you want to give up and stuff, but with the nature of conflict as it presently is, I think advising less conflict can be the better recommendation rather than more, especially when you're cooped up with your friends and family, you know?
Yeah, tension is not great in that sense. But, I think it's also, you have to be fair to the people who are, who feel like they're just who feel like they're not being represented. Mm-hmm. There's so much tension built up over so much time. And, regardless of whether or not you think it's legitimate or not, I think the emotion, at least, is genuine. And I don't think any country can survive any government can survive for very long without giving some outlet for that kind of outrage, for that sentiment. That's what democracy is about. Having an open, representative political system is meant to give a formal, institutionalized outlet for people who want these kinds of changes, or who want to change these kinds of problems. And it's workable. It can be done. I mean, for all of the violence and upset that we've been seeing over the past couple weeks in the United States, up to the point where I was talking to a friend from China, and they were telling me that they're not entirely sold that the United States is a safe country anymore. And I kind of had to give them that. I was like, yeah, I don't blame you. It doesn't look the best right now. Mm. But I think that's not really a flaw. I think that's not a bug, it's a feature, so to speak. Because if you have an open political system, then that means that you get to see the ugly part of human nature. And the privilege of living in an open political system is that you see that and get a chance to address it, which is not something you can do in a closed political system. You don't see what's wrong in a closed political system because the way that a closed political system deals with problems is to hide them. That's one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed. There were so many problems in the economy, but nobody could talk about them. There was no incentive to, and there was no incentive for the party to really deal with them. So they just festered until the whole thing imploded. Any closed political system has the strength of being able to mobilize the public under a strong centralized leadership. But a strong centralized leadership, especially in a large country, cannot address every problem at every level. And the longer you have an authoritarian system like that, the more those problems aggregate over time until they just get unmanageable. The smartest thing China ever did, and the Communist Party of China, is open up the economy and give limited opening at the political level. It was never as much as the Soviets did, but there was some. Because that gave people an outlet. That gave them something to do. It wasn't the government's fault necessarily that they failed. If they failed in an open economy, that was at least partly their fault. So that deflected blame from the party. The point is that as bad as it looks right now, this is what it looks like when free people deal with a problem. It's always going to be messy. There's always going to be some violence. There's always going to be malcontents. There's always going to be things like, looting and vandalism and whatnot. But that's at the margins. Most people don't want that. And you can go online and you can see lots of videos of people involved in the protests complaining about the rioting and how the rioters don't represent them and how the looters don't represent them. It's having an open political system means, well, I'll quote what's his face. I'm terrible with names.
So what's his face once said.
So what's his face? He was the guy that did Masterpiece Theater. Do you remember his name?
No.
He was the announcer. he did a documentary series in the 1970s on the history of the United States. And it's a really good series. I recommend it to anybody who's interested in American history. Even if you're American, I think it's neat to kind of see the US from the perspective of a foreigner. And one of the things he said that kind of stuck with me, and I think the last episode, is that freedom means the freedom to self-discipline. And I think that really is kind of the heart of a free society. It's not just that the government doesn't do certain things, it's that the citizenry steps up and manages problems itself and doesn't expect other entities or people to solve it for them. And that's what this is. This is the start of a movement to try, well, we've had a movement for a while to deal with these kinds of problems, but when there's a lot of outrage over things like this, then that starts change. That's the initial stage. And as bad as things are now and as bad as they'll get, I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic, given precedent, that there can be significant substantive change. And it's hard to see right now because there's not a lot of concrete proposals. Like you point out, it's not an organized movement right now. This is mostly the emotional phase. This is more about expression than about concrete proposals to actually change anything. But there's going to be local community leaders who kind of step up and do that at a local level. I know a lot of people judge America, including Americans, who are definitely guilty of this, judge the United States by the actions of the federal government. But the federal government is not the part of the US government that people have the most influence over. The level of government they have the most influence over is local government. And local government has an immense power over your life, probably much more so on a day-to-day level than the feds ever do. And local politics is dynamic in the United States. When people do want change, it happens. It does work. That doesn't mean there's not opposition. There's always that. And it may be that they're able to stop change. But it's possible to a degree that isn't going to be available in, China, Russia, etc. Well, maybe Russia, but that's a little dicey. I know this is an open forum, so I guess I can just ask. If you're Russian, how much power do you have in local politics? Because I haven't followed Russian politics in a while, so I don't know. So a little feedback there would be appreciated. But at the local level, that's where you're going to see most of the change. You're probably not going to see like big sweeping reforms at the federal level. If that's what you're hoping for, you're probably going to be disappointed. But at the level of the city, the county, the town, etc., there probably will be a lot of activism there, and there probably will be a response. And it'll be a mixed bag, but there probably will be at least some satisfaction amongst the afflicted communities that the police department and the local government are responsive. And again, that's going to be a form of progress. So it's not the end of the world. I've seen people on social media and Reddit who are talking about revolution and this is the end times and Zone G, what's going to happen. And realistically, there's going to be protests for maybe another couple weeks and then probably fizzles out. There's going to be something else in the news cycle. That's not inevitable. God knows I've been wrong with other predictions, but and certainly these are the largest protests we've seen in the United States in this vein in a while. I think these are probably the biggest we've seen at least since the LA riots back in the early 90s, certainly in the case of Minneapolis. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to last, and that doesn't mean that it's going to translate into a significant national movement. Again, what's going to probably happen is it's going to fracture into a bunch of local movements that instigate change at that level, which is where it's going to be most impactful, and so that's a good thing. But I don't know that it's going to really be that much bigger after that, because we've got an election coming up in November, so that's definitely going to dominate the news cycle. It's going to be Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. God help us. The debate is going to be pay-per-view viewing, I'm telling you. So that was my crack at the events in the United States over the past week. I hope I was able to do it sufficient justice, but given what I know, that's what I can do. Well, other than that, other than the riots and the protests. Was there anything else that kind of caught your eye, Neuro?
Trying to think about this week. We've got the masks versus no masks never-ending debate, which is usually just people stating their political preference, but they fancy it as a like reasoning for why you should or should not have them. Yeah, it's pretty silly in the sense of how divided it is and how little we understand. I think that makes it more ridiculous to navigate socially.
It was pretty disappointing to see the pandemic end up getting politicized. That kind of surprised me. I mean, I assumed that there was going to be some people who just rejected the government and any of its recommendations, because that's always what happens. There's always going to be some portion of the population that is just pathologically unable to accept instructions from authority, especially in the United States. That's just kind of in the culture. But the fact that it ended up being a political football, that kind of took me aback. I wasn't expecting that. I guess I shouldn't be surprised because, the policy question of when to open up, that was always going to be pretty controversial. But I guess it touched a raw nerve. We talked about this last week, I guess. But, the reason that kind of touched a raw nerve is because there's a lot of people who think that the government in general should provide more social services, more public services. And, they think that should be the case even in normal times, but especially if there's a national emergency like this. Certainly that at least should be a good reason to have broader public support being provided. And that didn't happen. And not only did it not happen, now we're talking about exposing the public to even more risk by opening up early and taking on the chance that there's going to be a secondary outbreak. I mean, there's going to be a secondary outbreak regardless, but now the risk is higher and it could be more virulent. So that I think just touched a raw nerve for a lot of people. I mean, specifically on the political left. That's basically what this group is. People on the political left who want more government support, don't have it, figured it would at least be justifiable during an emergency, and were disappointed, very disappointed, when that didn't happen, and now are just extremely frustrated that they're having to see an early opening on account of the economy. Because if you're not going to provide public support to people while having a quarantine, then you kind of have to end the quarantine, because otherwise you're squeezing them financially. You either provide them the resources they need to survive, or you open up the economy so that they can go out and get those resources. But if you close down the economy and then give them nothing, that's the worst of both worlds, and that's just not good policy. So I think there's a lot of political frustration on that count. That kind of accounts for the politicization. And, that's, to be fair, that's me being charitable to American politics, because obviously the current occupant in the White House also played a role in that. But I try to give him a fair hearing, so to speak, if only out of diplomacy. Did you know he started taking hydrochloroquine?
No, what is that?
See, that's the anti-malarial drug that a couple weeks ago, maybe months ago, I guess, he started saying was a cure for COVID-19, which it's not, and it's not even really a treatment. And from what I've read, the medical research on it suggests that it doesn't have an impact, and that it's not recommended to take because it does have side effects, which can be very bad depending on the individual taking it. And so he kind of kept pushing that as a potential solution, a potential treatment. I don't know why. There has been some evidence that it is able, amongst some people, to mitigate the effects of the virus, but I don't think I've seen anything that says it's a cure. So, I think there was the suspicion that he was just using it for political reasons, that he was just trying to downplay the impact of the virus by suggesting, we've got this under control, we have this treatment in place, and anybody who says otherwise is just criticizing me. And, so long as it's political cheap talk, who cares? There were some people, I think, who did take it and got sick. Well, actually, maybe I'm thinking of the other one. No, that was the whole Bleach episode. Yeah, that was something else. Yeah, that was the other crazy shit that happened. But I think over the 2 weeks ago or so, he came out and actually said that he himself was taking it. And I don't know if that's true or not, because again, it can be dangerous, but maybe his doctors cleared it. Maybe he wasn't at risk. There has been some people within the White House, I think, who were diagnosed with COVID-19. So it may be that there was concern that he might get it and that they were taking it preventatively. I think somebody in the administration did come out and say as much, that there were some world leaders who were just taking it preventatively. So that apparently is what he was doing. Allegedly, again, with the Trump administration, who the fuck knows? But that was a pretty weird episode. Just chalk that onto the list of weird shit that's happened in the Trump administration. There's so much shit going on in the world right now, Nero. I don't even know where to start. Like, it was so, news was really slow for like the past year or so. Like before January. Like mid-late 2019. And maybe that's because I was traveling for a bit of that. Maybe I missed some stuff. Kind of lost my tempo after that a little bit. But, it just kind of felt like things were on a rail, right? Just events just seemed to be moving along predetermined tracks, and nothing was really happening that was necessarily that surprising. There was a bunch of protests, but they never, those, we talked at length about those protests at the time, and they weren't particularly well organized, and as we've seen since then, a lot of them haven't really gone anywhere. Iraq is still Iraq. Chile went somewhere that turned into a constitutional referendum. Not that. They're going to change their constitution, which is a big deal. But we'll see what happens with that. That may not even result in significant change. Lebanon is still a mess. I think those were the big ones. I'm probably forgetting one or two. But those were, just sort of, those felt kind of like isolated events. Those were the culmination of local political trends, but they didn't necessarily signify greater changes. And so then 2020 came, and we've been on a bit of a roller coaster since then. And the news, the pace of the news just seems to get greater with every month. So we seem to be building up to a crescendo, which is a little scary. Kind of curious what that's going to look like, but we'll see. Oh, you want to hear the bad news, Nero?
I thought we just covered the bad news.
Oh man, we've got plenty more bad news.
Oh no. What else is bad news?
The ducks didn't work.
The ducks didn't work? I just told my family that there were ducks helping against the heckin' locusts. Do they need more ducks?
I don't think there's enough ducks in the world to handle it now, Nero. It's spinning out of control. Like what I was reading is that it's going to be on par with the last major cataclysm in Africa back in the 1950s, when the locusts got out of control and just ate out the agriculture for multiple countries. Like, it got really bad, and that seems to be where we're going now. And the latest news that I was reading is that it's spreading to South Asia. So now they're in India, as well as the Middle East and in East Africa.
Do we need bigger birds? What's the problem? Why are the ducks not working?
The longer that they're allowed to continue to breed without significantly reducing the population, the more they grow, and the growth rate is exponential. So the longer that they go uncontained, just the bigger the swarms become, and the more uncontrollable they are.
So it's like Zerg macro.
So it's like, yeah, pretty much.
Okay, I understand that.
So the number that I was reading today is that probably sometime next month, the next wave of the locusts are going to come. It's not a single swarm that's spreading. A swarm will bloom, it'll spread out, it'll lay eggs, and then things will die down for a while, and then the next generation comes, and it's even bigger. And then the process just repeats. So the next wave of locusts is going to pop up in northwestern India. And, if nothing is done, then the estimation is that there's going to be 1.9 trillion locusts in that mass, in that swarm. Which is a lot. That's an impossibly huge swarm. It could well be it actually could be the more destructive crisis. COVID-19 has killed a lot of people, but the dislocation and food shortages that could come from locust swarms of this size could be way bigger
Do you think it's
than
to the
anything
point
we've
where we
lost.
need to call Protoss to help us?
That would be helpful. That would be helpful, but it would be tough even for them. I was reading today that the Indian government was telling farmers to spray. That's their solution. And ducks aren't apparently the efficacious solution, but they're going with the chemical approach. But the farmers are saying that the spray is bad for the crops, and apparently it's not that effective against the locusts. So that may not end up being very effective, and it's exacerbated by COVID-19 because a lot of the agricultural sector in India is getting hammered financially. Commodity prices are down. People aren't buying because they're not going out as much. They're getting squeezed pretty hard, and so that means they don't really have the money they need in order to buy the resources with which to respond to the locusts. So not only is India getting smashed with COVID-19, which was always going to be rough because the government just doesn't have a lot of resources with which to respond to it, now they're getting hammered with a biblical locust swarm. I mean, the hits just keep coming. And that's just South Asia. That doesn't even get to Africa. It's still spreading out there. It's already eaten through southern Iran. And that's a country that already had an economy that was on the ropes. So as bad as COVID-19 is, by the end of the year, the story really could be the locust swarm. That could end up being much bigger because the economic impact has the potential to be way more significant, at least in the regions affected.
Have they talked about any solutions or measures that can be taken?
Yeah, besides the ducks, there's the chemical response. There's trying to dig up the eggs. It's kind of attack the breeding grounds. There's different approaches, but the problem is pretty much the same in all of the countries affected. They just don't have the resources. It takes money to buy all of the chemicals and spray that they need, and they don't have it. And a lot of the countries haven't been afflicted by a locust plague of this size in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
There are some that have pretty frequent run-ins with locust plagues that are smaller, from decade to decade. So those countries are relatively more well prepared because they kind of expect to have to deal with it. But the swarms are spreading so far and wide that they're impacting places that haven't had problems like this in decades, generations. And those places frequently don't have administrative agencies that are dedicated to this kind of problem. And so they're just totally unprepared. And since most of them are very poor developing countries, it's not easy for them to just go and borrow the money or raise taxes and revenue and just to kind of raise the money they need in order to try to get the resources that they need. So, India is among them. And again, in normal times, India might be able to manage a response, but these are not normal times. The virus has India's economy shut down. The government is struggling just mightily in order to manage it, and this may be a bridge too far for them. It's just too much. It's too much strain for a government of limited administrative capacity, not only for India, but just everybody else. So unless there's a cavalry coming over the hill, unless the developed world wants to spend a bunch of money helping them out, there's probably not going to be much they can do. And that's not going to happen probably because obviously the developing world has its own problem to deal with, which is COVID-19. That's a huge political issue and a massive economic issue that governments are struggling with, and they need all the money they can get to try to respond to it. Yeah, we haven't seen this in a while. This is multiple global scale crises compounding on each other. I don't know that that's happened in maybe decades. And, as you can see, once they build up momentum like this, it's just really hard to really do anything efficacious.
Yep, hang in there, world. It'll be quite a fate if 2021 is worse than this year.
Hey, maybe this just sets the pace for the whole decade.
Let's hope
maybe
not.
The 2020s are a wild decade.
Hang in there, team. Have some water.
Well, it's an era of change, man, We had a nice holiday from history for a couple decades. The Cold War, that ended in, 1990 or so. So after that, sort of the normal pace of change and competition and all of that just kind of felt like it slowed down. Things kind of reached a nice equilibrium. Well, for some places, I guess Russia had it pretty rough, but most of the world kind of did pretty well for the most part for about maybe 30 some years, a couple decades. And over that time span, we've just had so many fundamental things change in the economy and society and just different political systems around the world that there was inevitably going to be some big changes coming. You could already kind of see the trends. There was already changes happening. Just the distribution and the relative power between different states in the world. New markets, new economies, new technologies. All of these things were emerging in this time period. So you could see that things were changing, but you didn't really know at the time. Speaking as somebody who lived through that when I was a kid in the 90s, you could see all the change happening, but you didn't know where it was going. You just knew that it was going to change things. It was just obvious that a lot was going to change, but it wasn't really clear what that change would be. And now we're starting to get to the dramatic changes. We saw the mild changes first, and now we're starting to see the repercussions. Now we're getting to the meat. So history is back. It's going to be pretty rough for a while.
It's back, it's big, and it's not very pretty.
Well, that's the downside, but the upside is that in times of change, we've talked about this before, in times of change, that's when things are most acceptable. Maybe that's redundant. When things are unstable, let's say, that is when society is most acceptable to change. So, if it's difficult to reform things when things are super stable and people are risk averse and don't want to change, well, if nothing else, during a period of instability and violence, you have the opportunity to try to make some changes. So strike while the iron is hot, so to speak. Now's the time. Now's the time to kind of get your voice out there and try to participate in the formation of whatever it is that's going to come next. Hopefully something better, possibly something significantly worse. We'll see. All the more reason to participate. So that's South Asia. Lots of locusts happening. The other big thing was Hong Kong. Have you heard anything about this?
The US is now considering Hong Kong part of China, which means that they get messed up by the sanctions and stuff. And tariffs.
Well, they could. They haven't actually done it yet, but they're threatening to. But are you familiar with what instigated that?
No, actually.
So the changes that instigated that U.S. response and a similar response from other Western nations is a power play being made by Beijing. And, this is more bad news, Neuro. So, hang on to your hat. This could be the end game for Hong Kong. This isn't like what it was last year when the Hong Kong government was trying to pass extradition laws where they could extradite somebody who was suspected of a crime in China to China if that person was in Hong Kong. The changes that are coming now are going to allow the Chinese bureaucracy, specifically security institutions and others, to operate openly in Hong Kong, which the two systems, one country system, as it has been up until now, does not allow. And in fact, the change is explicitly illegal, but the Chinese government is going to push it through anyway, or at least that's what it looks like. And there's not much that Hong Kong is going to be able to do about that, it looks like. So I'll get into the details here. Let's see what we've got. Gotta check my notes. It's going to be a new national security law, and this is actually probably something that they've had in the cards for a while. So I don't think that this is something that they went out of their way to do because COVID-19 is distracting people or something like that. I think that they were planning to do this during the National People's Congress that had originally been scheduled earlier this year, and which ended up getting delayed because of COVID-19. So there was a little bit of a reprieve for Hong Kong in that sense, but now the delay is up and they're moving forward on this. So what exactly is it? It's a national security law, and it's going to ban quote unquote treason, succession, sedition, and subversion. And for those curious, no, these are not defined. They are ambiguous. And as anybody who's familiar with the law knows, when you define things ambiguously, that's a problem, because that means the government has discretionary power and interpretation. And generally, they're not going to interpret it in a way that you're going to like. All the more so when you're dealing with an authoritarian one-party state. Now, the reason I say this is technically illegal is because the relevant clause is, quote unquote, permitted only in matters relating to diplomacy, defense, and something else. Defense and other matters outside the limits. I think that quote got cut off there, but you get the idea. That was not supposed to be applied in this way. In general, there are laws that the Chinese government can apply to Hong Kong against its will, so to speak, but those laws are supposed to be narrowly related to matters of defense, diplomacy, etc. The sorts of powers that would be reserved for a national government. So technically, passing a law like this, in which a national security law like this, in which ambiguous notions of subversion, sedition, etc., have to be interpreted at the national level, that is not technically legal, according to this. For those curious, this is Annex 3 of the Basic Law that they're using. The Basic Law is kind of Hong Kong's mini constitution. That's what I keep reading it referred to as. And Annex 3 specifically refers to areas where the national government can impose law on Hong Kong. So this is an abuse, well, maybe not abuse, but it's a twist. They're twisting the law in order to fit their plan here, which is basically to open up Hong Kong to the national government's justice system. It's not going to be Hong Kong responsible for judging who's acting treasonous or sedition, engaging in sedition or what have you. It'll be specifically Beijing doing it, and they'll be operating openly on Hong Kong. So obviously the fear there is that they're going to target legitimate dissent. The law is supposed to be about national security, but I don't think anybody expects the Communist Party of China to interpret that narrowly. That's probably going to be a broad interpretation that encompasses people protesting against things like extradition bills or other potential abuses of power that might emerge. Basically, the Chinese government is not going to try to build trust with Hong Kong. They're going to conquer it, so to speak. They're not going to do it explicitly. They're going to do it slowly. They're going to slip the knife in slowly, and they're going to do it in a couple ways. One, let me see. I already mentioned that. That's something else they're trying to do. They have something called the Liaison Office, and the Liaison Office is the office that Beijing, that is to say, the Chinese national government, uses to manage its relations with Hong Kong. And historically, it hasn't really had much to do because it was mostly just about helping Chinese businesses set up in Hong Kong and vice versa. It was almost more of a symbolic institution. But the guy who was at the head of it was fired after, late last year, after it became apparent that the protests were not going to die down. In addition to helping businesses across the border there between China and Hong Kong do business with each other, he also acted as the avatar for the Chinese government in dealing with local government officials. Local government leaders, I should say. But he hadn't been particularly effective in doing so, and he wasn't necessarily forcing leaders to do anything. He wasn't pushy, so to speak. But since he left, he was replaced by a guy who I read described as a loyalist to Xi Jinping. And apparently, since he's been in office, he's been much more pushy. He's been much more demanding of the local government. Let's see, I had an example here. In April, legal experts, I guess in the media, reminded the office, that is to say the Liaison Office, that Article 22 of the Basic Law forbids interference by mainland entities in Hong Kong's domestic affairs. And the liaison, and that's true, by the way, that is technically the law. And the liaison responded by saying explicitly, we are exempt from that rule. And they didn't really offer much of a defense for that. I don't think that's the traditional interpretation of the rule, but that illustrates sort of the sneaking expansion of the government's power in Hong Kong. It looks like they're going to use the liaison office in order to indirectly control the Hong Kong government. they're not going to force them to do anything. They kind of can't do that right now, and there are still elected officials in the LegCo, Hong Kong's legislature. But what's going to happen though is that the Hong Kong legislature, which is not fully representative, there's a lot of appointed officials in the legislature. Those people are going to be very susceptible to Chinese influence. They already have been for a while, pretty much since the handover. But it looks like the liaison office is going to take a much more heavy-handed approach to trying to direct the way that they deal with public policy. And once the National Security Bill passes the National People's Congress, that's probably going to be the way that they do that. And I don't really know what the Chinese government's plan is here. Like, I don't know if they just fully want to subvert Hong Kong's democracy and want to take over the government. I don't think that's going to be the case, at least in the medium term. I think they're probably, and this is a guess on my part, so this is the speculative part of the answer. My suspicion is that they're going to try to focus on building patriotism, so to speak, because the Communist Party of China doesn't really understand liberal democracy or free citizens or anything like that. That kind of liberal democratic culture, political culture, it's pretty alien to them. So, what they see when they see people in Hong Kong protesting is people who don't sufficiently love their country and who are going to cause problems in 2050 when Hong Kong is formally integrated into China, kind of once and for all. So I think they're a lot more interested in trying to deal with the protests as a social phenomena that can be solved with appropriate education and re-education. And not re-education in like the Maoist sense. I mean, they want to introduce patriotic education courses in Hong Kong's education system, and they want to have laws enforced that prevent people from expressing what the party considers to be unpatriotic behavior, such as the national anthem. That was the other example I had here. This is actually kind of a different thing that's happening. The Hong Kong government is trying to pass a bill to ban disrespect of China's national anthem, because that's something a lot of protesters do, obviously, but then there's also footage of people at football matches who are booing the Chinese national anthem in Hong Kong before games start. So that's just another manifestation of this sort of attitude that they have. And I suspect that's more the gist of what they want. I think they really think that they can stop people from not trusting the Chinese government if they can just kind of get in there and criminalize what they see as unpatriotic behavior. And that's exactly the kind of heavy-handed approach you would expect from an authoritarian one-party state. So that kind of makes sense to me. But I could be wrong. One of the things I read was that in China, in mainland China, the actual administrative state at a local level, and well, at all levels of government, exercises direct power over, specific functions of government, over specific agencies like the police, propaganda, what have you, but that it's really the Communist Party at all levels of government that kind of controls them and directs them. So party officials, party officials overlap with officials in government. A lot of the time they're the same people. But in general, the party will kind of sit in the background and will just issue directives. This is what we should be doing in general. These are the goals and objectives, etc. So that's kind of what I think is, that's what I read anyway, was suggested that the party might try to do in Hong Kong with the liaison office. The liaison office may be sort of the proxy, the equivalent of the Communist Party in the rest of China, in the mainland. That could be, they could try to influence Hong Kong politics through the liaison office in the same way that they influence the governance of China on the mainland at any given level of government. So I guess the short version there is keep an eye on the liaison office, because that's probably where the action is going to be initiated in Hong Kong over the next year or so, if not more. So just to kind of summarize that, because that was a little disjointed at the start, the thing that the bill is specific, the changes that the Communist Party of China is going to implement are twofold. There are two main changes. They're going to pass a law that would ban treason, succession, sedition, and subversion, and impose that on Hong Kong. So that's one thing. But then the other side of it, the other aspect of it, is that they're going to allow mainland, let me just read the quote here, relevant national security organs of the Central People's Government will set up agencies in Hong Kong to fulfill relevant duties to safeguard national security in accordance with the law, end quote. So that's obviously a fig leaf for setting up police power, setting up Chinese mainland police if not the Chinese military generally in Hong Kong. Chinese military is already in Hong Kong, but they don't do anything. They just kind of stay in a barracks within the city. But there could be a more broad-based deployment of intelligence groups, police, military police, etc., if this law goes into effect. So those two laws together are what's causing the concern, and that's why the United States is saying that, if these changes come to pass, then Hong Kong will in effect not be a distinct entity from mainland China, and will therefore not deserve, and therefore will not qualify for the special treatment that it gets. Because for those who are not familiar, obviously Hong Kong used to be a part of the British Empire and the United Kingdom, and was handed over in 1997. So there was a question in I think it was 1997 anyway. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in 1997, the question arose, given Hong Kong has access to the entire world's economy because it's a part of Britain, and Britain obviously has a liberal economy and good relations with the rest of the world, is Hong Kong going to be able to maintain that same market access after the changeover, given that the People's Republic of China doesn't have nearly as much access to the global market, or at least didn't at the time in 1997? Hong Kong had a number of agreements with a number of states, free trade agreements, special access to financial markets, etc. So if that was not propagated in some form, that could have been a significant blow for Hong Kong's financial sector. And the agreement that was made with the United States and other powers is that so long as China allowed Hong Kong to be a separate entity that governed itself, that was at least nominally autonomous, then Hong Kong would be able to maintain its economic ties to the rest of the world without those economic ties being redefined in terms of those ties those countries had with mainland China. So that's always been conditional on Hong Kong being separate. And with these changes now, there's a question being raised of whether or not it's going to be separate in the future. And so the United States then is threatening, partly for political reasons, but also just to try to deter China from doing this in retaliation for these proposed changes. It's not going to matter. The United States cannot stop China from doing this, and the Communist Party of China is just going to accuse the rest of the world of interfering in domestic affairs or something to that effect. For them, it's a sovereignty issue. It's not a human rights issue. So they're going to be very defensive about this, and given that they consider it a national security issue, they're probably going to push it through no matter what happens. It's almost a symbolic issue. Is China sovereign over Hong Kong or not? And the more the rest of the world complains, the more significant it will be if they do push through these changes. And so that becomes an expression of Chinese sovereignty to the rest of the world. They're kind of flipping us off, telling us that you can't tell us what to do. We're going to do what we want. And given the whole century of humiliation in the context of China's history with the rest of the world, that's not really surprising. But unfortunately, that probably means that there's not going to be much we can do to help Hong Kong. I mean, there's already a trade war in place, so it's not like you can jerk up tariffs or what have you. That's kind of its own entity. That's its own negotiation at this point. I mean, you can boycott China, you can do different things like that, but it's not going to help people in Hong Kong much. They'll appreciate it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't do anything to help Hong Kong. By all means. But I mean, just in terms of realpolitik, like realistically speaking, what's going to happen one way or the other? I think what's going to happen is that they're not going to win. I'm sympathetic, but I just don't see how they can manage it. China's just too big. There's not enough leverage that can be brought against them. I don't think they're going to established party rule, because I think that would be a big hit to the local economy, since a lot of the business sector in Hong Kong expects, part of the reason they're in Hong Kong is because they expect light government and they expect rule of law. So if the party just goes full one-party state, that's over. It doesn't matter how much the party says that the business world doesn't have to worry. That's what they've been saying. Don't worry about this, so long as you're not engaging in treasonous activity or secessionist activity or what have you, you should be fine. But nobody really entirely trusts them. The example I saw referenced was the two Canadian businessmen that were detained in mainland China because that woman, Meng Haijiao, I'm not sure, I can't quite remember what her name was. She was the Huawei executive who was arrested in Canada in relation to U.S. accusations of sanctions busting. the accusation is that Huawei sold some stuff to Iran in violation of sanctions. And she was arrested in Canada, pending extradition to the US because of that. And the Chinese government got ripshit pissed at Canada because they saw that as an insult to them. And they responded by arresting 2 Canadian businessmen on what is suspected to be trumped up charges. And they've actually been holding them for like more than a year now, basically as de facto hostages over the Huawei issue. So that kind of rule of law, or lack thereof, is what is suspected to come to Hong Kong if the party does go there in force, like establishes full party rule there. And that's why I don't think the party is going to do that, because the business community would drop Hong Kong like a rock if they had to worry about that kind of shit. But I could be wrong. Maybe the party doesn't really care about preserving that kind of doesn't care about preserving Hong Kong's financial sector. They've kind of been grooming Shanghai for a while now to try to be the new financial center for China. So it may be that they're more interested in pushing Shanghai than they are in preserving Hong Kong. It's difficult to say at this point. It's an opaque one-party authoritarian political system. So unfortunately, I can't really tell what they're doing. Nobody can. I kind of suspect that they themselves don't really know what's happening in the party most of the time. That's the other side. That's one of the problems with a one-party state. It gets pretty cutthroat within the party itself, to the point where people can't really be open about what's happening, and in turn, even people within the party can be confused about just what's happening within the party in terms of political maneuvering and policy making and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's the bad news for Hong Kong. It's kind of coming to a head over there.
Yeah, it's the slow absorb strategy rather than the fast, we're going to have a military fight and then take it strategy.
Yeah.
And I think it's harder for the rest of the world to take issue, especially during 2020 with all the stuff going on.
Yeah, between the biblical locust plague and the all the other stuff. Yeah, it's probably going to get lost in the headlines a little bit. But don't worry, there's more bad news about Hong Kong.
Oh no.
This isn't the only thing. So the other stuff that I was reading, I read a couple articles on it, over the course of the week. One of the things I read, I think in an Economist article, is that people in Hong Kong may not be able to push back against this as much. So it's not necessarily going to be a resumption of the protests last year. And there's a couple reasons for that. Let's see here. So for one, people in Hong Kong are in general pretty exhausted with protests. Not everybody was a protest supporter, and even some of the ones who were are pretty fatigued by this point. So they may not get the same political support that they enjoyed last year. So that's one problem that protesters and dissidents are going to face. But another problem is that the business community also is a little fatigued. They lost a lot of money during the protests last year, and there were plenty of businessmen who supported the protests. But after getting squeezed by the unrest last year and getting squeezed this year by COVID-19, there's not as much political sympathy, and especially not as much financial viability, which of course causes anxiety. So that's not going to be as strong as a support. And that was a pretty important source of institutional support, because obviously in Hong Kong, the business community is very important politically. So they may not be able to count on them this time. And then the other problem that they're going to have is that the police have been learning. The police didn't really know how to handle the protests last year, but after months of experience, they're getting better. And one of the things that they have now that they didn't have back then, in addition to experience, is emergency powers due to COVID-19. The police have the power to stop people from congregating in large groups in order to stop the spread of the virus. Obviously, they can use that to stop people from protesting, because they can say, hey, even though your protest might technically be legal in normal times, there's an emergency now, you have to go home, and if you don't, we're going to arrest you. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of file that as you can consider that an example of emergency powers being abused in that sense. So those are all reasons that Hong Kong may not be as combustible this year, even though there's a major power play being made on the part of Beijing. And keep in mind also, again, like you just pointed out, Neuro, China's going to absorb Hong Kong by osmosis. They're not going to snap it up in one gulp. So it's going to start with a law here that's going to criminalize certain behaviors, and they'll probably prosecute isolated cases here and there slowly at first and then build up over time. So even if the law gets passed, there's not necessarily going to be a dramatic change at first. We'll see the full implications of the law over time. But it's just not going to be a dramatic fireworks show like it was last year, where it was just obvious that things were going awry and that people needed help and wanted change and etc. This year it's probably going to be more subdued, and yeah, that's probably where it's headed, I would guess. I could be wrong. That would be great if I were, but that's just what I expect at this point and what I've been reading. So I think those were the three major stories from the past week. The protests in the U.S., the locust swarms, and Hong Kong.
It's a busy week. When you said there's more bad news for Hong Kong, people were like, oh no, the locusts are going there too.
Let's see. So I think we did have a bunch of questions, so we can dig into that. And I'll start with the ones we didn't get to last week. I'm behind on news and I'm behind on life, behind on everything. So I may not be able to answer everything. I wasn't able to get to everybody's stuff that I said I would get to last week, so I'll try for next week. I had more proofreading work come up, so that ate up some time. Let's see. So we were talking last week about the FISA court reform.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody wanted to ask about the Friends of the Court change that was made. They specifically wanted to know who appointed the Friends of the Court. So I was actually trying to look this up just before we started, because again, was behind this week. From what I read, it's actually the FISA court itself that appoints the Friends of the Court. And they only can do so in specific circumstances. If the request for the court order falls under certain categories, which can apply to things like concerned civil rights or what have you, certain sensitive subject areas. In those cases, where the request qualifies, the court can, at its discretion, appoint a friend of the court in order to scrutinize the proposal for potential abuses. So it's a pretty softly worded law. It's not like a major change per se. The court doesn't have to do this, and even if it wants to do it, it can only do it in a relatively narrow range of court requests for court orders. And of course, if you don't particularly trust the judges on the FISA courts themselves, then this isn't really a change at all. So it kind of depends on who you talk to in that sense. Let's see. So this question, in my country, a lot of people currently do not believe the virus exists. We started local distancing pretty early, and I feel like we did not have so much cases, so many people had not actually have any contact with anyone who has the virus. I think this kind of thinking is dangerous. Can you share your thoughts? I don't know that it's dangerous. It's just, it's risky because it makes it more likely that people will be slack in how they observe social distancing and other safety measures to the point where you're at higher risk of having secondary outbreaks. So in that sense, yeah, it's a risky, but I think it's kind of inevitable. Like if you do a good job of taking preventive measures early on and the virus never really has much of an impact, then yeah, people will start to wonder. That's a good sign. That means the virus didn't do that much damage. But like you say, it could have the knock-on effect of opening the door to a further round of infections. But it's not surprising, and I don't know that you can do much about it. Human behavior is difficult to control. I think we Americans know that better than anybody.
Especially Texans.
Especially Texans. So, yeah, it's of concern in so much as there's a risk of secondary infections, secondary outbreaks, and in that sense, it's worthwhile to try to remind people that just because it's not here doesn't mean that the effort that they're making to take action isn't working, isn't having an effect. But, I mean, if you're asking if this is something unexpected, no, I would totally expect this kind of behavior. We've already had it here in the U.S. in plenty of places. There's lots of places. I think California was one of them. There's apparently been people in California saying that the virus isn't as big a deal as it was made out to be. And I think that's specifically because they took action relatively early. But I think there's a sentiment that maybe it was just overblown. And I think that's kind of the mistake being made. Actually, I think I saw that on the Joe Rogan podcast. They were talking about it there and saying that, there are hardly any infections, so the whole thing was overblown. But I think they just didn't take into account that that's probably the result of the explicit action that was taken on the part of the government and by citizens. And that is reversible. If you start screwing around now, then you could well see a lot more numbers. So let's see. Somebody last week was asking what games I've been playing recently, if any at all. Some people smoke, some people do drugs, some people drink. I procrastinate. So that's the big thing. That's my major vice.
That's your drug of choice.
That's my drug of choice, unfortunately, much for the worse. So yeah, I have been playing some games recently. I shouldn't be, but I just kind of fall into it sometimes. A lot of the time, if I'm honest. I think, actually what I was doing this past week, I just kind of got a hair up my ass and I just sort of started trying a bunch of stuff in my Steam list that I hadn't tried in a while or hadn't tried at all before. So, I would kind of pick one and play it for a little while and then pick another one and try that. Just those humble bundles over the past decade, really filled up my Steam list. You could get so many games with those humble bundles and other things for so cheap that I just ended up grabbing a bunch of stuff, and now I just got a huge list of stuff I never really got around to. So that's a lot of that is the stuff I've been doing. I think War Thunder I played more of. That's pretty cool for me because I was an armchair general when I was a kid, so I really liked vehicles, military vehicles and stuff. So it's actually pretty cool to see a game that has lots of different planes and tanks and stuff, especially ones that are kind of low profile. I in particular had fun flying the Soviet planes because nobody talks about the Soviet Air Force in World War II. We will. We'll get to it someday, but
was it a pretty good Air Force?
Not really. Some of the individual planes were pretty good, but the Air Force as a whole was not up to date. It was not modern, and they didn't have well-trained pilots. So you can't really say that it was like a really powerful Air Force. It got better as the war went along. That was true for a lot of the Soviet military in World War II. But in the beginning, it was pretty bad. It was the vast majority of the planes the Soviet Air Force had were obsolete, and most of them were actually destroyed on the ground. Because, of course, the Germans launched a surprise attack. It probably shouldn't have been a surprise, but the Soviets were surprised, and so the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, actually caught out most of the Soviet Air Force's planes in Eastern Europe anyway. Caught them on the ground and destroyed them on the ground in that first initial wave on the first day of the conflict. So that was a hammer blow, and most of what they had left was still, old stuff, obsolete stuff. There's a lot of stories about Soviet pilots who just had to ram German planes because they just didn't have anything else they could do. Sometimes they'd run out of ammo, didn't have ammo, and other times they just couldn't really dogfight with the Germans because the Germans had the better planes. So they would just try to ram them. They'd try to fly up behind them and chop up their tail with their propeller. That's obviously a one-time thing. You can't do that more than once. But that's just how desperate they were in the early stages. I think later on they started building some better planes, like I think the Locutions were supposed to be the best, from what I remember. That's actually what I was flying in the game. If you're Russian and listening to this, please correct me on this, because I am interested. This is stuff I remember from way back in the day. But I think it was the Locution Fighters. I'm obviously mispronouncing that. I don't know what the correct pronunciation, but I remember the Locution Fighters being mentioned as the best fighters that the Soviets had during the war. They were not the most common fighters. The most common fighter they had was, I think, the Yakovlev fighters, like the Yak 3, Yak 9, etc. And those were the ones that formed the backbone of the Soviet Air Force. I think they were easier or cheaper to build or something, so they ended up with a lot more of them. But I think technically the LA-5 and the LA-7 were better, just technically speaking. They also had MiGs. For those of you familiar with Russian aircraft, there's obviously MiGs. They actually had them back during World War II as well, but you never really hear about them much because they really weren't very good, like even by the standard of Russian planes at the time. The Mig Fighters had relatively poor performance. They actually did have good performance at really high altitude. But the trouble was that that's not really where they needed them, so that wasn't very helpful. I think they ended up using them for reconnaissance a lot because they could just fly at high altitude, go fast, photograph a given battle space, and then fly out. And because they were so maneuverable, that was pretty efficacious. But other than that, it was mostly Kovlev and Locution fighters and aircraft that kind of carried the weight. Now I'm talking mostly about fighters. I guess there's also the attack planes, and there was one in what? It was so famous that it actually got its own video game. It's still famous, but the name is kind of slipping my mind. I don't think it was a Sukhoi. Was it a... No, it wasn't a Tupolev. Or was it? That's going to bug the hell out of me. It was a tank buster plane, and it was really well built. It was very resilient. I'm looking that up because I really want to know. It bugs me that I can't remember. Sturmovik, yeah. That was the name. That was sort of the nickname. Ilyushin, that's what it was. Ilyushin 2. Totally forgot about Ilyushin. Yeah, that was probably the most famous Soviet plane in World War II. That was a really effective ground attack plane, difficult to shoot down, very robust, easy to maintain, pretty solid plane. So in that sense, that actually was probably the best aircraft they had in general. It wasn't a fighter. I think people generally focus on fighters when they talk about air forces, but the attack planes are kind of the workhorses. So the IL-2 was definitely a good plane. I think, yeah, I guess they had that from pretty early on. But they got shot down a lot because, again, the Germans had the better fighters, so they generally had air superiority. I don't think it was until later in the war. I guess I don't need to get into this, but I like the Eastern Front, so please forgive the tangent. I think it wasn't until later in the war that the Red Air Force really started to kind of meet the German Air Force on equal terms, because by that point, the German Air Force was under pressure by the Allied bombings. That had to redirect fighters and interceptors out west to try to deal with that. And there was also a shortage of resources, and also the Russians were getting more experience. So they had better pilots, and they had better aircraft later in the war as well. And I think the turning point kind of came in 1943, I think. Like late 42, early 43. Because what happened in that time period is the evacuation of the Kuban Peninsula. I hope I'm remembering that right. Let me see if I'm going to try to explain this without a map, but it might be tricky. Everybody's familiar with the Battle of Stalingrad. But there was some really dramatic events after the Battle of Stalingrad. After the German army was surrounded in Stalingrad, there was a larger Soviet offensive that tried to push the Germans away from the city, and as well as just back generally. And that served to push the Germans all the way back to Rostov. And Rostov is a city right on the coast in the northern Caucasus. It's like right on the border between the Caucasus and the Ukraine. And Ukraine, sorry, I'm not supposed to call it the Ukraine. we got bitched out for that a couple of years ago, I think. On the border between Ukraine and the Caucasus. And that was a really important choke point because when the Russians were about to take it, there were still a whole bunch of German forces to the south of that. And what happened is that the Russians, I think, actually did cut them off. I think they did take the city. And the result is that there was a large body of German forces cut off in the Caucasus, separated from the rest of the German army in Ukraine. And the result is that the Germans had to evacuate that army group by sea. And they ended up on what was called, I think it was called the Kuban Peninsula. And the result was this giant air battle. Because obviously, the Soviet army was pressuring this pocket that had formed in the Kuban Peninsula. But they also threw in just about all of their air assets to try to disrupt the convoys and, the evacuation and whatnot. And that was the first major air battle where the Soviets were able to kind of really fight them on relatively equal terms. The Germans still had the better fighters and more experienced pilots, but by that point, the Soviet Air Force had managed to build up to the point where the air battle was an actual air battle and not just a one-sided massacre. So after that, the Soviet Air Force was much more relevant because they were able to get air superiority more often. I think the Germans still had it for a while, but by the end of the war, the Soviets definitely had it. And that Battle of Kuban was the turning point. Anyway, that's a long-winded tangent to that question. What were we talking about? Something. I'm not even sure. What was the question? Oh, what games? What games have I been playing? Yeah, I was playing Russian planes on War Thunder, so I was doing that. Star Trek Online. I was getting into that more recently. That's actually an MMO. Have you heard of that, Neuro?
What is it? Star Trek Online?
Obviously, you know what. Yeah, have you heard of Star Trek Online?
No.
Yeah, that's actually an MMO that you can play, and you get your own spaceship. You get your own ship, and you can do ground missions and stuff. It's a little dated, but I think it's fun. I think it's pretty cool to have your own ship and kind of do fleet battles and stuff like that. I was a Star Trek fan when I was a kid, and I always loved the. I shouldn't have, since the space battles were not the point of Star Trek, but I was always pretty impressed with the space battles in Star Trek. So that was pretty cool to be able to kind of live that in the game.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, pretty fun. So I did that and just some other random stuff. I'm not even sure I remember it. Obviously, it didn't stick, whatever it was. I wanted to play Civ 6. You kind of piqued my interest when you started it up. That's pretty fun to do. But I don't think I ever got around to it. I was doing too many other things. I need to stay off Reddit. That's been another time sink.
Yeah.
I don't know why I bother, because all I ever do when I go on Reddit is just read the comments and just kind of be upset. What's the point of that?
Your Reddit experience is working as intended.
Yeah. Yeah, that's.
You have to read the headline too, though. You read the headline and you react grumpily to the headline with other people who are reacting grumpily to the headline, and then there's a comment 16 down on like the third most upvoted thing that's saying the headline is way off the actual content of the article.
Yeah.
But you don't find out about that until 45 minutes into this furious rage.
Yeah, that was a habit I'd kind of broken back in the day. I just kind of got tired of engaging in politics. It's one of the reasons I ended up distancing from political issues. It's just outrage culture is exhausting, and it just doesn't really result in much. It just seemed like it wasn't worth my time anymore. So I ended up cutting down on Dig and Reddit and the other stuff that I was doing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I still come back occasionally, especially again when I'm procrastinating. It's a terrible habit. makes you do terrible things like spend time on Reddit.
Oh, the world is falling apart because Agent Smith browsed Reddit once again.
That's not helpful to me anyway. Let's see. Do you think cryptocurrency will ever be as big as all its believers say it will be? We haven't had a cryptocurrency question in a while, have we?
It's about time.
Man, this is vintage 2017 stuff right here. Short answer, no. Short answer is no. I think the technology, the underlying technology behind cryptocurrency could be useful. And there's actually been some traction on that. Facebook has been working on that. Facebook made news a while back talking about how it was going to release its own currency, but that's not actually true. And they've actually backed off of the currency aspect of it since then. That was actually a payment system that they were working on, and the cryptocurrency aspect of it was actually just one part of it. So it wasn't really them innovating a whole new currency. They were just creating a new payment system that incorporated cryptocurrency technology as part of its structure. So that's the kind of thing we can look forward to. I think financial institutions and payment systems and the companies that make them, they might use the underlying blockchain technology. But I don't think cryptocurrencies are ever going to supplant standard currencies, fiat currencies and currencies like that. Even the gold bugs don't like it. The gold bugs all think that it's a laugh. They think that gold is the one true faith and that cryptocurrency is a kind of cheap imitation. So when even the gold bugs discount you, that's a bad sign. Let's see, what are your thoughts on space exploration and asteroid mining? How long do you think it will be before we begin colonizing other planets? Did you see that this past week, Neuro? The shuttle launch?
I heard about it, didn't see the launch itself.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. The US hasn't had its own ability to launch astronauts into space since the shuttle program ended about 10 years ago. Because the shuttles were getting old, they were expensive, and there were budget cuts, and there's just a lot of problems. And so we just kind of leaned on the Russians and the Soyuz launchers. Soyuz. Not sure how that's pronounced, actually, now that I think about it. Sometimes there's words you read all your life, and then one day you realize I've never actually said that out loud and don't know how to say it.
And the first time you get to practice is on World Discussion.
Yeah, I saw you had 1,000 people listening earlier, and I got a little nervous.
Yeah, sometimes we get a nice raid from a full-time broadcaster and they've got a hype community that's ready to roll, and everyone's like, what's this? Is this a podcast? How do I get this? It's like, no, this is a real person. Like, whoa. I think a lot of people end up liking it after they've gotten a sense of it's an actual real person talking about things, and no, he's not trying to recruit you into some new amazing club of political firebrands. But if you want to join such a club, it's not hard to find one.
Yeah, there's no shortage. Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's a private sector program. The launcher is created by a private company, SpaceX, as owned by Elon Musk, and NASA is just contracting them out. So that's something that's been proposed for a long time and that they've been working on a long time. But to actually see it finally come to fruition is pretty wild. It is kind of the next step in the space program and in space exploration.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty wild stuff. And did you get a chance to see the inside of the capsule?
No.
It's pretty cool. There was one of the nice things I saw on Reddit. Occasionally they do post something that's actually nice. Was a comparison of the control panels for the different capsules over the past half century. And the capsules way back in the 60s are they look like airplanes. It's just normal analog instruments. And then the more recent space shuttle had more had a couple LCD screens and still had some analog instruments and stuff, but it was more digital. And now with the I think it's called the Dragon, is that right, chat? Kind of correct me on that, but the new capsule that they're using, it's just 3 touch screens, and that's it. All of the interaction between the astronauts and the controls is purely done by touchscreen. Like there's not even a joystick that they can use to fly it. It purely has to be done through the touchscreen. It's pretty neat. I actually was talking with my grandparents about it, my grandmother specifically, and she was watching it, and she's old enough to have been around for the original, moon launches, the original space program to get into space and all that jazz. And she was telling me that just watching the astronauts in the new suits and the new space capsule, it was like watching something from a sci-fi movie for her. It just looked futuristic, and so it was pretty cool for her to be able to see that. So to get back to the question anyway, thoughts on space exploration and asteroid mining. That's not something I've followed very closely, so I can't really speak on it that much, but it has to be super expensive. I don't know that the technology is there yet to really do like private sector exploration and mining and whatnot, stuff like that. So it's probably going to be a long time yet, I would guess. For those of you who are more invested in science news and technology news, please do contribute in chat, what you know about it. But I myself haven't followed it closely enough to know what the status is on that. But I haven't heard anything in particular. I think there's been a lot more progress on progress. There's been a lot more progress on deep sea mining. I have read about that, and that actually is happening now. But space mining, not so much, I don't think. And I have no idea how long it'll be before we colonize other planets. It's probably going to be a long time. I know the Trump administration was kind of crowing about how they're going to go to Mars and all this sort of thing, but I'm not so sure. I don't know. I don't know how much of a priority Mars is, given everything that's happening with the U.S. government right now. So I wouldn't hold my breath on it. So that's probably a long ways off. Let's see. Do you have any comments on the proceedings with Netanyahu? I heard he was charged. He was. For those of you who don't follow Israeli politics, the Prime Minister of Israel right now is a guy named Benjamin Netanyahu. And I know I'm mispronouncing the name, so I just apologize in advance. You can correct me if you like. I could have sworn it was Netanyahu, but I think somebody mentioned that that's off somewhat. That's my best attempt. Netanyahu has been around a while. Like, he was prime minister in the 90s, but then he lost power, I think, in the early aughts. And he regained power. He was voted back in, I think, in like 2008, 2007, something around there. And he's just kind of been hanging in there ever since. I think he's the longest serving Israeli prime minister in Israel's history at this point. He's very conservative, and he's very much a national security politician. That's very much how he couches all of his policies. I think I was reading today that he went into a courtroom as part of the trial, and just as part of his rhetoric, he actually brought up the Holocaust, which sounds very vitriolic and offensive, I'm sure, but that's actually his go-to move. Like in Israel, he's known for that. Like whenever he's talking about a major threat or even a threat to his government, like a political threat to his government, it's not unusual for the Holocaust to come up, whether it's appropriate or not. He justifies his government in terms of being strong on national security. So he often talks in terms of threats to Israel, usually in existential terms. For those of you in the United States listening, you can kind of think of him as being a George W. Bush type figure in a lot of ways. Our Bush era ended in 2008, but Israel's never did. They've been stuck with their George W. Bush for more than 10 years now, and everything that implies. So his case has to do with the corruption allegations that were made a couple years ago. And it's, pretty pedestrian corruption type stuff, and it has to do with influence peddling, and he tried to make a deal with a newspaper, giving the owner of the newspaper some favors in exchange for favorable coverage. That was one allegation, I think, if I'm remembering it correctly. And then there was another allegation about giving some wealthy, I think, American guy, a wealthy foreign benefactor, shall we say, giving him favorable treatment so that he could get a visa, I think is what it was, or maybe a passport, something like that, some documentation that he needed in order to get into Israel. So supposedly he went out of his way to give him that favor in exchange for donations or campaign donations or some other form of political support. So just generic political corruption, you could say. Those are the allegations. It's not necessarily explicit. It's not like what he did was necessarily obvious corruption, but the allegations allege that it was, in fact, a kind of quid pro quo that constitutes de facto corruption, and which is why they're going after him. So, of course, he says that the whole thing is a witch hunt and that it's all bullshit and, they shouldn't be after him in the first place. Whether or not that's true comes down to your political beliefs. Israelis are kind of split on that. In general, I think like, the Tel Aviv crowd, as it were, sort of your liberal, hip, modern Israelis are generally skeptical, at least, of Netanyahu. Whereas your sort of Jerusalem Israelis, the settlers, the Orthodox Jews, and the very conservative part of the population, they tend to like him a lot more. So that being the case, there's a lot of partisanship, suffice to say, in Israel. I don't think it's going to mean much for the Palestinian peace process. I think there's a large majority of Israelis who are pretty anti-Palestinian at this point. But that doesn't mean that they're pro-Netanyahu. You kind of really saw that with the election recently. With the big rivals to Netanyahu were the Blue List, or I think that's what they were called, led by Benny Gantz. And Benny Gantz is actually a pretty conservative guy. He's a background in national security. And his principal gripe with Netanyahu was not that he was too hard on the Palestinians, suffice to say. His big criticism is just that Netanyahu was corrupt, has been around too long, and is not serving the interests of the country well. He's not he's not handling foreign policy well. He's not handling domestic politics well, etc. You never hear about domestic Israeli politics, because whenever you hear about Israel, it's always in terms of Palestine. But there are actually normal politics within Israel that don't have to do with Palestine. And a lot of it has to do with economic inequality, because the Israeli economy does pretty well. But because it's done well, there's been people who were left behind, people who did not benefit. And there's, in turn, a lot more inequality. So that's one problem. There's people who want more redistribution, want more assistance from the state, and there's people who explicitly don't want that. So that's one of the political fault lines in Israel. In addition to, corruption allegations and disagreements over foreign policy generally. So there's lots of criticisms of Netanyahu in terms of domestic Israeli politics, above and beyond, the foreign stuff. So that's kind of where Israeli politics is, and in turn, that's sort of how different people, that informs how different people in Israel interpret the corruption investigation. Now, as for Netanyahu himself, and as far as what's been happening with the proceedings, nothing is going to happen anytime soon, because it's going to take like a year for the court case to go through, and even after that, there's going to be a whole bunch of appeals that are going to drag it out even longer. So there's going to be no conclusion to this in the short to medium term. Netanyahu has played his cards very well, and he's going to stick around a while. We'll see what happens after 2 years. I think that's probably going to be more informative, because he's, the COVID-19 thing broke out at the perfect time for Netanyahu, because Benny Gantz was chomping at his heels. Israel had 3 inconclusive elections in a row, and nobody was able to form a coalition because nobody had a large enough majority. But then after COVID-19 hit, there was a strong public demand for a unity government, and that pressured Benny Gantz into a coalition with Netanyahu that he really did not want. Netanyahu wanted it, but Gantz did not, very explicitly. And as part of the coalition agreement, Netanyahu is going to be prime minister for like a year and a half, I think it was, something like that. And then after that, he's going to step down, and then Benny Gantz will be prime minister for the next year and a half. That may or may not work out. We'll see what happens when Netanyahu is actually supposed to step down. That remains to be seen. It's important whether or not he steps down, because as prime minister, he gets immunity. And I don't think other ministers get that. I guess he could step down and become just a regular minister of parliament, and then maybe he would still have it then, but I'm not sure how that works exactly in Israel. But the point is that what's going on with the proceedings? That's what the question was. He was charged. The court case is proceeding forward, but there's not going to be much happening really for a while. The court case itself could be dramatic. Netanyahu himself has wasted no time in using it to grandstand. He's trying to bolster as much political support as he can, and so that he can have as much leverage as he can to sway over the proceedings, and in order to try to get out of trouble as much as he can. But we're not going to know how all that works out for like another year or two. So you'll probably see the court case in the headlines, but nothing of substance is going to happen for a long time. Did Russia successfully steal Venezuela's stockpile? I have no idea. This person remembers hearing that it may have been stolen by Russia on an airplane. I'm not sure what you mean by stockpile. Is that like gold? I know they've been doing a lot of gold running lately, but I hadn't heard of that. I Googled it briefly before we started because I was kind of looking through some of the questions, but I didn't find anything. So I'm not sure what specific incident they're referencing here. So I don't have anything to offer. If this person or perhaps somebody more familiar with what they're talking about can post a link, just in chat or something, I would appreciate it, because then I could get an idea of what this is, because I could well have just missed the story. That's quite possible. So I would be curious what that's about. Let's see. Next question. Do you think that China is not trying to pull out of its role as the world's producer? I think that this has a big role in the passing of the torch in terms of India becoming a larger producer than China. I actually saw this person commenting in chat last week. Yeah. So I think I did see the sort of genesis of this question evolving in the chat conversation. I'll address this question, but then I also wanted to get to something that I read this person say in chat. Do I think that China is not trying to pull out of its role as the world's producer? It's not trying to end its role as the world's producer explicitly, per se. What it's trying to do, I think, just to elaborate the point here on just what Chinese policy is, the Chinese government wants to move up the value chain. Right now, the stuff that the Chinese manufacturing sector produces and has been producing for a while is pretty low-end stuff. It's not like super techy person. It's like trinkets and things like that that require lots of cheap, low-wage labor. And that's useful. It provides jobs and whatnot. It provides opportunities. But what China really wants to do is to develop a manufacturing industry that can provide jobs for educated people. Because right now, China actually produces a lot of people with engineering degrees who can't find a job in engineering. I know people in the US like to talk about how China produces way more engineering students than we do, engineering graduates than we do, and that this is a problem because it means our manufacturing sector isn't going to survive, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, that's its own debate. We can get into that if somebody wants to, but the point is that it's a little bit oversold, because a lot of the people that graduate with engineering degrees in China are not able to really find a good job. There's just not enough opportunities, and a lot of them end up with like assembly line stuff, which is not what you want to do when it's not what you're thinking of when you're working on a degree in engineering. So the Chinese government would really love if the Chinese economy could start producing companies that produce high-value goods, because those kinds of companies require more educated workers, and those are exactly the kind of workers that are not getting enough opportunities in China right now. So that's really more the gist of China's economic development policy. They want to produce better, more expensive, high-tech stuff. So it's not that they don't want to be the world's producer, it's just that they don't want to be the world's producer of cheap shit anymore, because that's not helpful anymore. It used to be. It did serve its purpose. But at this point, political and economic objectives have shifted, and they've shifted in a way that it's no longer a priority to try to retain that type of manufacturing. So it's the loss of that specific type of manufacturing that's occurring. And it's not just occurring, though, and this is another important point, it's not just occurring because of government policy. It's not just occurring because the government itself wants it to happen. It's also occurring for natural economic reasons. As there's been economic development in China, the cost of living has risen. And as the cost of living has risen, labor has become more expensive, to the point where China does not really have that much of an advantage in terms of the cost of labor anymore. A lot of the industries that have originally produced in China, that produced cheap stuff, that used cheap labor, a lot of them have actually already left China and relocated to places like Bangladesh or Vietnam or Taiwan. Well, not Taiwan. Bangladesh, Vietnam, and other equivalent low-cost, low-wage type markets. And that's already kind of unfolded over the past 10 years. It's been happening for a while. A lot of the manufacturing that China still has left at this point is either the stuff that's relatively more capital intensive or stuff that is high tech, because they have started to develop a tech industry. It's not as big as they want it, but it is a lot bigger than what they used to have, and it has been growing. So that, I think, is a more specific explanation of what is happening vis-a-vis China and India. China is not going out of its way to get rid of its status as world's lead producer. It wants to get rid of, wants to prioritize specific industries at the expense of certain others. And that's what China's trying to take advantage of. It wants to grab some of those industries that are leaving China. But like I mentioned, they're kind of late to the party, because a lot of those industries that are already the most sensitive to changes in the cost of labor have already left. And the ones that are relocating now are generally relocating for reasons that don't have to do with low cost of labor. They have to do with the trade war with America. They have to do with uncertainty in China. They have to do with uncertainty in what would you call it, logistical supply chains, international supply chains. It has to do also with a desire to, I think we were talking about this last week. I'm trying to remember. Resourcing, I think, is what they were calling it, which is where they move to they don't move back to their home country, but they move to like a country that's neighboring their home country where cost of labor is cheaper. It may not be as cheap as it could be in like Bangladesh, but the fact that it's geographically closer to their home market reduces costs, like transportation costs, and it also reduces uncertainty since the supply chain is shorter and there are fewer points of failure. So all of those are major blocks to India picking up a lot of these industries that are considering leaving China. We talked about this more at length last week. So if you want a more coherent, detailed explanation of what India has been trying to do and why it's not working, that's kind of where I would direct you. But the other thing I wanted to say here is that this person was arguing in chat that do I even remember it? What was it? Well, I think I don't remember exactly what it was, but I just remember the response that I had. Yes, it matters that India is trying to become a major manufacturer. That is relevant. But my whole point last week was that there are a number of institutional blocks that are going to prevent that. I'm sure they'll get some new manufacturing relocated from China, but it's not going to be much. Because the fundamental factors that have been afflicting the Indian economy over the past half century, that have prevented the emergence of a large, robust manufacturing sector, are still in place. They have not really addressed those at all, hardly. And so long as that's the case, they're not going to develop a manufacturing sector indigenously that's of any substantive size or relevance, nor are they going to be able to attract other manufacturing firms from other parts of the world. Neither one of those are going to happen so long as the economy is as closed and tightly regulated as it is. It's just not really feasible, So that was more the point I was making. I wasn't saying that it doesn't matter whether or not the Indian government tries or not. I was just trying to argue and point out just the institutional barriers there that are probably going to prevent it. Let's see. So then I think these were today's question. I just learned oh Jesus, here we go. I just learned about the petrodollar earlier this week. Can you tell me what you know about it and how it's affecting the world?
God help us.
Yeah, this is one of those questions. So there's certain, what do I call them? There are just certain myths that refuse to die. They just kind of keep on going. And this is one of them that we've kind of addressed on here before, but it's been a long time. Hasn't come up in a while. the petrodollar is a thing. That's not a myth. So, I mean, I guess I could just kind of briefly explain what the petrodollar is. Major oil producers around the world, generally the focus in terms of the petrodollar is Middle Eastern countries, but really it's just any major oil producer. They sell a lot of oil to the United States, as well as, obviously they sell a lot of people to other countries, but also to the United States. And when they do so, they sell it, well, the price is denominated in dollars. And when you pay for the oil, you're supposed to pay in dollars. So even if they're not selling to the United States, other countries or companies or what have you that do not use the US dollar have to pay for their oil with the US dollar because most major oil producers price the oil using dollars. Now, because of that, major oil producers end up with a shit ton of US dollars. They have just massive cash reserves. And those reserves are the petrodollars. That currency that they hold is the petrodollar. It's US dollars that were obtained through the sale of oil, hence the name. And petrodollars are important because, being oil producers, they have a lot of it. They have a lot of money. And so they can really throw their weight around financially. They can invest in, billions and billions of dollars in bonds. They can invest in stocks, venture capital, like whatever they want. And it generally has a substantive impact because it is just such a large amount of money. So that, in short, that's a very short, discrete answer, is what the petrodollar is. Now, how it's affecting the world is where we get to the problem area. Because this is where there's a lot of speculation and persistent myths about the role that the petrodollar plays in the world economy. And this is actually something that I saw in chat just last week. Somebody was saying that if the petrodollar goes, if oil stops getting denominated in dollars, then the US economy is going to be in big trouble because the economy in the US is so dependent on other countries using the US dollar to pay for oil. Because as the argument goes, because so many countries have to pay with dollars, there's more demand for dollars than there would be otherwise. And that inflates the value of the dollar more than it should be, and in turn helps the US economy. Such that if the US dollar were not so inflated, or if we're to lose that privilege, we're to lose the privilege of being the principal currency through which oil is denominated, then the economy would take a significant hit. That's wrong. That's just wrong. That's not how petrodollars work. That's not how they influence the economy. And that's definitely not how the US economy works. The petrodollar is not the backbone of the US economy. The backbone of the US economy is production. The US, contrary to popular opinion, actually does produce a lot of stuff. It produces a lot of manufactured goods, and it produces especially a lot of services sector stuff. Tech industry, financial industry, etc. Those are some of the principal cases in point, but just also others like entertainment, for example. The U.S. exports lots of movies and whatnot. So the core of the U.S. economy is still production. And, if anything, having an overvalued U.S. dollar hurts that because it makes it harder to export. It makes exports less competitive. So what role does the petrodollar play, if not, floating the U.S. economy, as some people would argue? Back in the 70s, it was really important. And it was really from the 70s that the myth was derived. Because in the 70s, it really meant something strategically speaking. Because keep in mind, in the 70s, the Bretton Woods system had only recently imploded. Right? The Bretton Woods system, for those of you not familiar, was the system of managing the global economy that was agreed to after World War II amongst Western nations. The Soviet Union didn't participate. It was a system that was technically a gold standard, but really, well, it was a US dollar-based standard, but it was technically a gold standard. Because the dollar was based on gold still. It was still tied to gold. And but everybody else just based their currency. They fixed their currency to the dollar. So gold was still important because gold was sort of the core of it. But the US dollar became the main currency on which all others sort of orbited around. And that was the case from 1940, whatever it was, 48, 49, whenever the Bretton Woods Conference was, up until the early 1970s. And, that what happened there had to do with, different things. Having fixed exchange rates is all well and good, but you do need international cooperation to maintain them. Because, the US dollar, for its part, was losing value left and right because the US government wouldn't stop spending money. It had the Vietnam War and the Great Society program under Lyndon Baines Johnson. And both of those things just greatly inflated the money supply and devalued the dollar. So in order to maintain the fixed exchange rate, other countries had to in turn also devalue their currencies. The trouble was a lot of them didn't want to do that, especially Germany, because Germans have a rather painful, unfortunate history with hyperinflation, and they're very sensitive about it. So for that reason and other reasons, the Germans in particular, but also probably some others, refused to devalue their currency in order to keep the fixed exchange rate. Now, all of this was exacerbated even more by what were called euro dollars. And euro dollars were dollars that were freely traded on financial markets outside the United States, which wasn't really entirely supposed to happen. Because again, the whole point of the Bretton Woods system was to have a fixed exchange rate regime that also corresponded with capital controls. That was the other side of the Bretton Woods regime. It wasn't just fixed exchange rates. There was also a lot of capital controls that restricted the flow of money between economies. That was designed in order to, for one, mitigate risk and the risk of international collapse of currency values and recessions and that kind of thing. It was kind of a dam in that sense. But it was also meant to help regulate the fixed exchange rate. In order to maintain a fixed exchange rate, you have to, increase or decrease money supply, raise lower interest rates to try to control it, and that becomes very difficult in a free-floating exchange rate system because the market forces can just completely overwhelm a central bank's ability to control the value of the currency. So capital controls and fixed exchange rates were sort of the twin pillars of the Bretton Woods system. Such as I'm not an expert, all right. So full disclosure, I'm not an expert. I'm talking from stuff I read like years and years ago. So again, Chad, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure there's some detail I'm getting wrong somewhere, or maybe something important. I don't know. Again, I'm going from memory. So please be merciful. But those, as I recall, those were the twin pillars of the Bretton Woods system. And both of those could not be sustained because the U.S. government and its European allies in particular just could not agree on who should bear the burden of dealing with the change in the value of the U.S. dollar. The U.S. government said everybody else should lower the value of their currency. But everybody else, especially Germany, kept saying, no, you should stop spending so much goddamn money. And that was an impasse that the Nixon administration in the early 70s just could not reconcile. And the result is a power move by the Nixon administration, which was to just blow up the whole system. They just said, fuck it, we're going to go to a free-floating exchange rate, and anybody who doesn't like it can just go stuff themselves. Pretty bold move at the time. And it completely changed the world of international finance. And that's kind of the point I'm getting to. Because at that time, international finance had kind of been strangled by the Bretton Woods system for a long time. It was not like what it is now, where you've just got trillions and trillions of dollars in liquidity sloshing around the market. There's so much money now, people don't even know what to do with it. They invest in just the dumbest shit. The fact that the tech industry doesn't make much money, but still gets billions of dollars in venture capital money, angel investors and that kind of stuff. That just really illustrates how desperate capital is for a return at this point. That was definitely not the case in the 70s. Venture capital just was barely getting started in the 70s. And that's just because there was so little international flow of money. It had just been restricted so much after World War II that there just wasn't much liquidity there. And that got to be a big problem in the 70s because the US government, again, was spending too much money. It just wouldn't stop. And that was a bipartisan issue at the time because everybody and their mother was into Keynesian economics then. It was thought that if the economy was slowing down, you needed to spend more money. And so there was what was in effect a kind of stimulus government spending program that was in effect across both Democratic and Republican administrations. That was just the orthodox thing to do when the economy slowed. But stagflation didn't fit into that model because with stagflation, you had slow economic growth, but also inflation, which wasn't really supposed to happen according to traditional economic models at the time. So that kind of just what's the word I wanted? Buffaloed. Let's go with that. It buffaloed multiple administrations such that they didn't know how to handle it. I'll just pause here and define buffaloed because I'm sure we've got some non-native English speakers and also some probably non-American English speakers who have no idea what the fuck that means. That's an old school term in the US that just refers to something that kind of confuses you. Like, oh, this thing really buffaloed me. I couldn't figure it out. Some random trivia for you.
Buffaloes are very confusing animals. Why do they have wings and why are they so tiny? Why are they so delicious?
I like that. I'm gonna have to eat. I can't eat wings though. Goddamn virus. You're tempting me, Neuro. You're gonna get me sick.
Don't do it.
Yeah. So that was the big move by the Nixon administration, and it stemmed from the fact the government was spending too much money, and part of that had to do with the government not knowing how to respond to slow economic growth combined with inflation. So the government kept spending money, and so it started issuing a lot of debt, and it got to the point where people didn't want to buy any more debt from the U.S. The U.S. Treasury actually got to be devalued, and it got to a point where the government was getting desperate. Like, who's going to buy all of our debt? Like, how are we going to pay for all this bullshit that we apparently can't cut spending on? And it backed the Nixon administration into a corner. And with the free-floating exchange rates, that dealt with the issue of the U.S. dollar. It dealt with the issue of the fixed exchange rates, because then the U.S. dollar could just devalue. But the devaluation was really steep, and that actually kind of made it really hard to import oil. And the price of oil, as you know, was very expensive in the 70s on account of all the oil embargoes. So between the debt crisis and the oil crisis, the Nixon administration was really getting squeezed. So what the hell do you do about it? Well, what they did is threaten to invade Saudi Arabia. They didn't do it explicitly. They did it kind of implicitly. They did it in diplomatic speak. I know some of you who have never known anything but the Trump administration may not understand what subtle diplomacy is, but trust me, it does exist. It has existed before, and it's what the Nixon administration used in the 70s. They printed an article in a magazine called Foreign Affairs, which is still like the premier foreign policy magazine in the United States, if not also other places. And in this article, which was written by, I don't know if it was written by Nixon. I think it was written by like an admin guy of one sort or another. But they made the point that, very just sort of discreetly, if the Saudis continued the oil embargo, that could be considered an act of war. And maybe the United States will have to act forcefully in response.
Oh.
They never said that they would do it. They just said, this could happen. Wouldn't it be terrible if something happened to your country? It's a nice country, but it'd be really sad if something happened to it. It was that kind of logic, and the Saudi diplomatic corps picked up on that signal, and there were negotiations not long after. So in those negotiations, it was agreed that the Saudis would resume pricing oil in terms of dollars. That was partly to deal with the devaluation of the US dollar that happened immediately after the abandonment of the Bretton Woods system. Because again, in a fixed exchange rate regime, market forces are not setting the value of the dollar. And it got to be really overvalued because the government was pumping out too many of them. So when the free-floating exchange rate regime was implemented, it just tanked. It just collapsed in value. So in order to try to mitigate that, in order to try to bump the value of the dollar, the Saudis were made to price oil in terms of dollars, which, mind you, they'd already been doing. But they stopped doing it because of the oil crisis. Because of the oil embargo and because of the collapse in the value of the dollar, it wasn't really efficacious for them to continue pricing in terms of the dollar. So they started pricing in other things. So just to help the US out and to not get invaded, they agreed to reverse that decision. But the more important thing that they did, and this is important to the debunking of this myth about the petrodollar, the more important thing that they agreed to do is to invest in U.S. treasuries. Because the more important crisis at the time was not the U.S. currency crisis, it was the debt crisis. Because that's what was really squeezing the federal government. So it was the Saudis at the time that actually bailed out the federal government of the U.S. They used the petrodollars to start buying, well, again, to resume buying, I guess I should say, U.S. treasuries. And that alleviated, if not ended, the debt crisis in the U.S. in the early mid-70s. That's the real power of the petrodollar in the 1970s. But people continued to believe after that the petrodollar was a cornerstone of the financial system, even as you got into the 80s and 90s when the international financial system started getting way more liquidity, to the point where the US government didn't really have to worry anymore about liquidity. Because again, it was the liquidity crunch in the 70s that was the real problem. The US government just didn't have anybody who could buy the debt. And the US dollar was tanking, obviously, that was important too, but without any buyers to the debt, they were screwed. Now it's pretty hard not to find a buyer for US debt. It's hard to not to find a buyer for Argentinian debt, and nobody should buy Argentinian debt. There's no reason to do that. But there's just so much money sloshing around now that even now people will buy debt from countries that are almost definitely going to default on you. That's how much evolution has happened in international finance. So in that way, petrodollars don't matter nearly as much as they did, because there's just so many alternatives now as far as who can buy US federal debt. And obviously the US dollar itself has stabilized in terms of value. The immediate correction that happened after the free-floating exchange rate was implemented was never going to be permanent. I think some people not familiar with currency markets think that when a currency just collapses in value, then that's forever. But it's never really forever. It's just a correction. It's going to take a while for the economy to adjust to that, but eventually things get back to normal. The currency will increase in value relative to others. It's just a matter of adaptation. It can take a long time, especially if a government gets involved and tries to help, quote unquote, and ends up making things worse. But in general, equilibrium will be reached again. Now, the immediate problem at the time was not that they didn't think equilibrium would be reached again. The immediate problem was that the devaluation was so traumatic in the short term that they needed to do something in order to mitigate the damage. And I might add here that the Saudis valuing the oil in dollars probably did not really help the dollar all that much. It mitigated the decline, but it probably didn't stop it. And if you look at the data, if you look at the value of the dollar, even after the Saudis agreed to that, it still tanked again later on when the Iranian revolution happened. So it wasn't a cure-all. It took a while for the US dollar to stabilize as a currency as a result of that change from the Bretton Woods system to the free-floating exchange rate system. But the myth persists. There's just this persistent insistence on the part of both right and left. It's a bipartisan thing. It's not even just like one group or the other. They just insist that petrodollars must still be very important in the economy, of the US in particular, if not the global economy writ large, because there's just so many petrodollars. But the global economy is like $100 trillion. It's very high. There's definitely a lot of petrodollars sloshing around, and they are important in the world of finance. But they're not important to the underlying economy in the world, and I would argue not to the US either. I think, the myth partly persists for different reasons depending on who you talk to. I think there's a lot of gold bugs, on the political right, on the libertarian side of the political spectrum, who just don't like fiat currency. They insist that the US dollar is on the edge of collapse. It's going to collapse. They always say that. It's like 1 year, 5 years, 10 years from collapsing. Because they think the government is printing too much money, and they think that the government is just totally irresponsible, and that nobody should expect it to ever stop printing too much money. And hence, the value of the dollar must be getting propped up by something. If it hasn't collapsed by now, it must be the result of some outside influence. And so petrodollars are an easy explanation there. And then on the political left, there's a kind of political economy argument. There's this argument that the US has invested in the Middle East strategically because it has to protect that oil, because that oil must be super important to the US economy. And petrodollars is the explanation then. Oil is important because of the petrodollar, and because without the petrodollar, the US economy would tank. But I don't think either of those explanations is right. I just don't think they're well argued. I don't think they're rooted in history, and I don't think they make sense economically even. So that's, maybe this person is just an innocent person innocently asking about petrodollars because they're just genuinely not familiar with it. So I mean that's probably an info dump for them. So I apologize if that's more than they were bargaining for, but I think that is an issue that pops up a lot, and I see it in chat sometimes. So that is something I try to address when I see it. There is a misunderstanding about the role of the petrodollar in the economy, and it is a broadly held one.
Can I pay for my gas with petrodollars?
I guess. Technically, you could. I mean, they are dollars. That is the key thing.
Okay.
I never explained euro dollars, did I? I just kind of wandered off on that point. Yeah, euro dollars were just the Bretton Woods system regulated international capital, so it was hard to get it to. It didn't flow very well. But what happened is that dollars did flow to some degree, and so people had reserves of dollars. Businesses, individual investors, central banks, and just because they wanted a return on them, they wanted to do something with them. Small markets emerged in which you could invest your dollars, and they weren't kind of supposed to. They just kind of found loopholes in the system to move the money around. But eventually, there emerged a large market for U.S. dollars outside of the U.S., and that was sort of the downfall, or part of the reason for the downfall of the Bretton Woods system, because that unregulated market put pressure on the exchange rates that central banks couldn't control, or at least had a lot of difficulty controlling. And that combined with prodigious spending by the U.S. government just totally upended the system. Between the U.S. government not being willing to compromise and between market forces in the Eurodollar market putting downward pressure on the exchange rates, on the U.S. dollar specifically, the whole system was just unsustainable. So that's a quick and dirty explanation of the Eurodollar there. I kind of skimped over that, I think. Sometimes I lose my train of thought. I apologize if that was confusing. So yeah, that's the petrodollar. Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, you could go for another 20 minutes if you so desired.
20 minutes. Okay. We don't have the little Zencaster thing.
No.
Zencaster timer. I couldn't quite time it.
We're just running purely on instinct right now.
Purely on instinct.
No, I did
just
see.
Raw Red Bull.
Hell yeah. I did see when we started.
I can't drink that stuff. It makes me sick.
I would not choose to drink that. It's kind of like all the up of coffee with the really gross feeling crash.
Yeah. Yeah, I tried it once in grad school because I was working on a paper that I just really needed to focus on and hammer out, and it ended up backfiring totally because I ended up so sick that I couldn't work on it.
I think your body gets used to it at a certain point. I do know that gut bacteria changes quite a bit based on what you eat.
Does it all die when you drink Red Bull?
Probably. I don't know. I don't know what all these uppers they're supposed to be putting in energy drinks are that are not caffeine. They make me feel weird. And there's also that arousal curve, right, where you can get hyped up and it's beneficial to a point, but past that point, you're just shaky. You don't have a steady hand anymore, and it's hard to focus as much, become more distractible and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, focus is a hard one. I can't begrudge anybody trying to find a supplement, but I'm just really wary of caffeine and Red Bull and energy drinks in general. Yeah, it's hard for me to get into it. Let's see, so what do we have? Given the disregard for the First Amendment rights of some protesters and the use of quote-unquote non-lethal force in the form of rubber bullets aimed at heads, at what point is it permissible for protesters to use the Second Amendment to fire back? The funny thing is that I can't tell if this person is a radical leftist or a libertarian. This could go either way.
He's actually Canadian.
Canadian, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's see here. How would that? What is the law on that? I don't think you could use lethal force in response, because generally when the police are doing that, they're supposed to only use non-lethal force like that if they're trying to control a crowd or clear a square or something like that. So if you fired back in response to that, then you would be inhibiting police duty, and it would be illegitimate use of force and etc. And probably something in that vein. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of that for the next couple of weeks probably. Just when you scream obscenities in someone's face and throw shit at them, there is always going to be a non-zero probability that they wreck your shit. That's not supposed to be true for police, but given human nature and given that police are human, it's going to happen. And when you have just hundreds of thousands of police all over the country confronting an even larger number of protesters on a potentially daily basis, even if it's only a small number of police engaging in illegitimate use of force, you're going to have a lot of examples to work with. And it could be a larger proportion of police doing that for the next bit, just because tensions are so high. So it's going to be pretty ugly for a while. That's not to excuse it. I'm not saying that police should be allowed to do that or anything like that, but I'm just saying expect it. It's going to happen. Hopefully that leads to efforts to try to tighten up standards for police and testing and police academies and whatnot. But I mean, even if you have a lot of substantive change and improve the police force to the satisfaction of the U.S. public, you're still going to have police who do shit like that. It's hard to keep yourself under control when you have assholes screaming in your face. It's just very tempting to pop them with something, a rubber bullet or a baton or whatever. Professionalism amongst the police force is the ideal and the standard, but it's just hard to achieve that, especially given present circumstances.
I can't remember which riot it was, but there were some riots where we talked about the difference between protesting and rioting and how the two often go together, but it's not always the same people. Because a protest creates an opportunity for a riot to be more successful. So you have the kind of people who maybe they're politically connected to the issue somewhat, but a lot of them are just like, hey, here's a chance for me to go get some nice shit for myself and break some stuff.
Yeah, there's always going to be opportunists. And that is kind of the difference between the protester and the rioter. The protester is there because they're genuinely interested in exercising their rights as citizens so that they can take advantage of the freedoms available to them to exact change, to advocate for change. The rioter is just there because it's fun, because they want, like you say, it's more self-interested. I'm sure there are some ideologues as well who just do it because they think violent protest is the only type of legitimate protest. And I think I read something on Vice that there's people on the far right who actually have been showing up to the protest. They apparently see this as like the potential first stage in a civil war or a race war, as the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're participating, either acting as agents provocateur or as people who just want to exploit it to go tear shit up, either to delegitimize the protests themselves or to just inflame tensions generally.
I think we did talk about how politics and your orientation is closer to a horseshoe rather than a left to right spectrum. Because the extreme right and the extreme left have overlapping behaviors and tendencies. Like the far right and Antifa are both okay with like using violent means to achieve their ends.
Yeah, that's a good description of it. Yeah, that is, both the far left and far right in the United States, just this is their moment. This is the stuff they live for. This is their opportunity to kind of go out and wreck shit and just take advantage of the general mayhem that is kind of prevalent around. Well, not prevalent. I shouldn't say prevalent, because not all the protests have been violent. Here in Dallas, they've actually been pretty tame. which is a good thing. But not everywhere, and in other places where there has been more violence, that is kind of them who are propagating that, either of the far right variety or the far left variety. I saw a video on Reddit today of a black woman protester who accosted two white young girls dressed all in black. So maybe that's not that's not inherently a sign of radicalism, but that is kind of the inference that one makes. And they were spray painting the side of a building. I don't remember. It was like a Wendy's or something. And she just started telling them off, saying that, this isn't us. This isn't what we want. You're not helping us.
Mm-hmm.
And they just kind of casually walked away. I don't think they cared. For them, it's if you're a radical, then protests don't really mean much to you. Radicals want radical change, and they think radical actions are the only way to do that. And they tend to discount other methods. Not always. Some radicals are smart about it, but the kinds of people who show up at protests and just commit random acts of violence, I don't think those are the smart ones per se.
Yeah, protests are interesting. To an extent, you have to have some sufficiently major demonstration of your discontent for a protest to be effective. So to be blocking streets, for example, is one that is very inconveniencing to the people who do business in the town and that kind of thing. It brings a lot of attention to the protest as well. So it's like, you want people to protest nice. If they're not getting their needs met or their demands met, then it's going to be pretty hard to make them go away. And if they can't even articulate how their demands would be achieved, that's even more difficult. And that was the Occupy Wall Street problem. I think the current problem is easier to articulate, but the solution is really difficult to iron out. Like, how exactly do we fix a broad systemic problem?
Yeah, it's a difficult balance to strike. It requires a lot of political strategy. It requires a lot of insight. It requires objectives. It requires a lot of the things that a lot of movements haven't had in the U.S. for a while. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily need a centralized leadership, but you do need some solid strategy, some good ideas, and some direction. And a lot of protest movements in the U.S. over the past couple decades have been pretty aimless in a lot of ways. Occupy is kind of the principal case in point, but I don't know that I've known of any others that have been all that well managed, that at least got to any scale anyway.
Mm-hmm. We did talk about the Hong Kong protests and how those were, compared to a lot of other protests, pretty well organized and managed, and they also found common ground with like the business sector and things like that. So they created allies for themselves. It wasn't just we're standing on their own. We're trying to find other people who think this would work well for them too.
Yeah, I guess just as an addendum to that, because this is something that I kind of thought of. I've thought of this before, but I forgot to mention it when we were talking about the protests earlier at the beginning of the episode. Something to keep in mind in order to kind of understand African American communities in the United States and their perspective. Keep in mind that they lived in an authoritarian country until 1965. That comes with a lot of implications. Because if you study political systems and people that used to be authoritarian, it's almost always the case that they don't trust authority figures, up to and including the police. And that's a problem with trust. But it's an understandable problem with trust, because in an authoritarian system, there's no transparency. There's often a lot of violence, frequently indiscriminate and arbitrary. That's the kind of country that they lived in up until just maybe 50-some years ago. So just think about the implication for the political culture in the African American community. Like, for them, they're not living in one of the oldest, most stable political systems in the world. From their perspective, they're living in a transition state. It's more like Poland in that sense than it is France. It's a state that used to be authoritarian and is trying to transition into a liberal democracy. That's where they are in terms of their perspective, or at least a lot of people, historically speaking. I can't speak for them, obviously. But I think that's illustrative of a lot of where the tension is coming from and helps explain that perspective and where the lack of trust comes from. Let's see, is my 20 minutes up or do I have more time?
We've got 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Neighborhood. It's not up.
Neighborhood.
Hard stop.
Okay. Gotcha. Do you think the business community in Hong Kong will leave and go to another country like Singapore before complete absorption into China? It depends on what China does. Like, if they really do, like I was saying before, if they go full party control, then yeah, they'll relocate. Maybe some of them will go to Shanghai, and maybe some of them will go to Singapore, what have you. It may not end up mattering too much, because what I was reading is that a lot of the companies in Hong Kong, or at least that are listed on Hong Kong Stock Exchange, are actually Chinese now. So in that sense, it won't necessarily change that much if they are cut off. The foreign companies will leave, and Chinese companies using Hong Kong as a kind of portal through which to engage with the financial world outside of China, that goes. But given that a lot of Chinese companies are there, given that most of the companies in Hong Kong are Chinese anyway, it won't necessarily be as disruptive as you might think. So they're not going to leave, obviously. They'll probably stick around. They might draw down operations, but they won't leave. But the foreign companies that are there, they will leave if the party just full-on one-party states Hong Kong. But if it's something softer, if they just do, honestly, if they just do the national security law, and they're not too heavy-handed about how they interpret it, like a lot of people suspect they might, if they don't do that, then the businesses will probably stay. It's businesses can operate in an authoritarian political system. We see that in China. And in Hong Kong's case, they do have rule of law. They do have their legal system, and that's not what's changing. The national security law doesn't necessarily impact business. It's meant to be a political tool used against political opponents. So if you don't open your mouth, you won't necessarily be caught. Like I was saying before, though, you could still get caught because, the government may go after you as a tool against a foreign state, like what was happening with the Huawei issue. So that's no guarantee, but that just means there's more risk. And it may be that there's not sufficiently more risk for foreign businessmen to warrant pulling out of Hong Kong. So the answer to the question is it depends. It just depends on how heavy the boot of the Communist Party is in Hong Kong going forward, and that remains to be seen. That's an open question. What is your view on the geopolitical tension between Hindus and Muslims in India right now? What with the major cultural and racial discrimination? Man, that's a big question. There's a lot of historical context there, and I can't do it in like the 5 minutes I have left. Let me think here.
But if you had to.
If I had to do it. I'll say this, the current iteration of tension between Hindus and Muslims is modern. It is not historical. And I think that's an important point. I think if, I don't know how many people from India we have listening. It's probably not very many. But, maybe they can kind of clarify this for me or, tell me what they think of this opinion. But most of the historical violence between Hindus and Muslims generally has been more about communal tensions of one sort or another. It has historical roots, basically. But the modern violence has a lot more to do with the current politics of India. It has more to do with the BJP and some of their, not their policies per se, but their rhetoric. They've kind of empowered, emboldened. I'm trying to avoid the word emboldened because I think that's kind of a goofy word. But sort of in the same way that the Trump administration has been accused of emboldening the far right in the United States, specifically far right extremists. There's a similar accusation that is being levied against the Modi administration in India in terms of emboldening the far right in India, specifically the Hindutva, the sort of Hindu supremacists in India. The avatar for Hindutva in India is a political group called the RSS. And don't ask me what that stands for. I can't ever remember. It's like Rashtriya Swami something something. And again, can't. It doesn't come. It doesn't roll off the tongue if you're not a Hindi speaker. But the RSS is probably India's longest running Hindu supremacist organization, and they're a very weird group. They're all about Hinduism, but at the same time, they take a lot of their politics from authoritarian political ideologies from Europe. So it's kind of an ironic mixture there. But to be fair, the BJP is not explicitly Hindutva. It's just Hindutva are in their political coalition. And because they are in the political coalition, the government doesn't really do as much to kind of clamp down on manifestations of anti-Islamic sentiment or, violence. And as a result, there's been a lot more violence over the past, 5-10 years. And it's been getting worse. There was a pretty big riot this past year in New Delhi. So that's more the genesis of the tension now. And I think as much as it's political, then it can also be solved politically. I think the government could do more to tamp it down. And if there were a change in government, if Congress could get back in power, or some other opposition group, that would probably help a lot. Because say what you will about the Indian National Congress, and there's a lot bad you can say about it, but at the very least, they have been nominally dedicated to secularism in India. And, I don't want to get into an argument about whether the BJP is secular or not, because I know that's where this is going. But I think at the very least, you would agree that the BJP is much more tolerant of mixing Hinduism into their politics to a degree that has not really been done very much before in Indian politics. And the Indian National Congress, in so much as it has principles, that's pretty debatable too. In so much as it has principles, one of them has been trying to distance religious radicalism, if not religion in general, from the governance of India. So if either Congress or something like Congress could get back into power, they could probably tamp down pretty significantly on these manifestations of communal violence. They won't end it. It's probably never going to go away completely, but certainly in terms of their rhetoric and in terms of their policing policy, they could do more, and that would be helpful. So I don't think this is going towards like a crack up. I don't think India is going to have like mass violence per se. Maybe some low intensity conflict. They've already got a couple of those, but I don't think it'll go much beyond that. It's a manageable problem. It's just been allowed to fester. That's the issue. So with that said, I guess we're out of time.
Well, it's been one hell of a week.
It has. It's been wild stuff. It's been really fascinating to watch. History is kind of gearing up. We've had a holiday from history for 30 some years since the end of the Cold War, and now it's kind of finally getting back into it.
Do you think TV dramas and shows are at risk of going out of business because the just general news is more entertaining than what they could write in fiction?
Say what now?
Just fucking with you.
No, I just genuinely didn't hear it.
Oh, I was asking if with the global drama and stuff that if TV writers are going to be struggling to think up more fucked up shit than is happening in the world.
They can't because they're all in quarantine.
Oh.
They can't do anything. I don't watch TV much, but my grandparents do, and a lot of the stuff they're watching now is, even the regular TV shows involves characters in quarantine and communicating with each other over Skype, and it's weird.
Yeah.
It's very strange. So there's kind of a limit to what they can work with now, correspondingly. But you're right. There's going to be a lot of fodder to work with in the future. Hopefully we'll get some good film noir movies out of it at least. Need to bring film noir back. That's a cool genre. We've got lots of inspiration now all over the world.
Hold fast, ladies and gentlemen. Try not to be shitty to your relatives. It's my advice. I know that it's easy to beat the drum of your political party, but that's probably not the best way to give each other support right now.
I concur. You gonna jump into Civ 6 tonight, Nero?
I'll probably rest earlier tonight. It was a pretty heavy week, and yesterday I streamed for about 10.5 hours, so we've been putting in the time.
And sleep. I've been getting short on sleep myself the past couple weeks, and it's starting to take a toll.
Sleep is good.
I can understand. It really is. It really is. Try sleeping more, folks. It's good for your health.
Get that super powered pro gamer performance. 8+ hours of sleep per night. It's really strong.
I'm sorry you've been having a rough couple of weeks, but stay strong.
Thanks. I think it's all kind of within the realm of stuff where people are appropriately grumpy about a uniquely and unprecedentedly fucked up world. So a lot of that I'm not taking it as personally, because that's the...
To be fair, and I know you didn't mean to talk about like the fucked up world per se, but it's not really fucked up. This is actually more normal. This is kind of the world returning to mean.
Yeah.
It's always been unstable. It's always been unpredictable. There are just short periods of time when things are stable enough to make people think that they can kind of predict events and that things are stable and that, oh, we've kind of reached the pinnacle of history. We don't have to worry about history anymore.
So we've been taking this whole period of peace for granted, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Whole.
To put it bluntly. Yeah, this isn't unusual historically speaking. This is actually pretty normal. And in fact, if it does keep getting more normal, it's going to get worse. That's why it's so important to try to really dial in and be, participate and just be active and be aware. Because, the actions that we take can have significant consequences for the future because we don't know what's coming. We're going to form a lot of new norms and institutions to try to deal with what's coming. And in that sense, it's really important to just be aware and to try to be active to make sure that those norms and institutions are as effective and, I don't want to say friendly per se, but are as effective and in keeping with our established norms of liberal democracy, freedom, ethics, and morality, etc. We don't want to go Mad Max.
Some people probably would really like rocking that aesthetic, just saying.
That's true.
You've got some pretty cool fashion.
I have to grant you that. But it looks a lot cooler than it feels when you're getting somebody smashing you in the face with blades and gunfire. And I never saw the latest Mad Max movie, so I guess I can't really use that analogy. But
it's a good one.
Yeah, it's cooler to just pretend. Keep it on the internet. There's a lot of things that are much better kept on the internet than in real life, and that's among them. But we can make it if we focus and work together. So, there's an upbeat tone there for you.
Hear that, people? Focus up, and we're going to make it through this to the next peaceful period that we'll take for granted.
Exactly.
I appreciate you very much coming on, my friend Whiskery, and thank you for helping us out with the questions and chat. Thank you for helping to drive this awesome conversation.
Yep. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Sweet. And come by next Sunday in the evening time, and we may have another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith for you.
Yep. Well, you have a good night, sir.
Cheers. You too, buddy. See you around.
See.
Nice. Okay. Can we win this second game?